What's up, guys? How are you? Good to see you guys. We are going to get started here in just a few minutes. Currently shadow banned, which is fun. Unfortunate. You post one video, they label it as misinformation, and all of a sudden you just... It's amazing the power they have on this app. It's absolutely bananas. What's up, Butterbean? Melly, hi. Hello. What's going on, guys? Yay, I'm on time. Thanks for being here. Thank you for being here. So just so you guys know, hi, Kellogg, hello. Hey, just so you know, what's up, Adnerb? What's up? How are you, Sheesh? And sorry to hear about the shadow banning. Yeah, no, it's crazy. It's such a bummer too. So I don't know. I'm not really planning on too many people being here, but you know, if there's one of you guys in here, I'm sending it. So you're gonna get it. It is a bummer though. So just so you guys are aware, I am not planning on many people coming in here, which is fine. It is a bummer. And it's because, so I posted a video like 2 or 3 days ago about some kind of technology that was called AI Pin. And it was a repost. I reposted the video of somebody else posting it. And it was up for, I don't know, a couple hours, and then it got taken down, and I got a warning, and it said misinformation. And then after I got that misinformation, I posted another video, and then that video still only has like 120 views on it. So normally within the first couple hours, there's a couple hundred. So I'm like, okay, well, I guess I am being shadow banned. And, you know, there's everybody who liked it was everybody who follows this channel. So that also shows me that it's not going out to anybody else. Like there was not a single person on there who is not following this page. So I'm just like, cool. So first time being shadow banned. So it's good to be here. But that's okay. I'm okay. That is completely fine. No notifications again. Yeah. I'm not surprised. I'm watching Prince of Egypt right now. Nice. Hi, Michelle. You at work again? Julianne, hello. What's shadow banning? Shadow banning is basically where you are still able to do whatever you want on your page, but it doesn't get pushed out there. They basically remove you from the algorithm. So it's fun, but that's completely it's not fun. You're baking? Nice. I'm not baking. I am, we're about to, Melly, you gotta stop baking. We got Bible stuff. I love God so much. Man, no kidding, Jalen. Early tonight, yeah, hi. So no trolls. We'll see. I don't know how it works when it comes to the whole live situation, but as far as me making a video and putting it out there, doesn't seem to really be working. Baking in scripture, yum, yep. Hello, Respiratory, how are you? Good to see you guys. I'm glad you guys are here, lifting me up a little bit, which is very nice. You got notified? Awesome. See, Katie. Hi, Katie. How are you doing? Hopefully you're doing well. I had so many people slide up on my stories saying thank you for talking about God so much. Yeah, man. Keep that up. I'm eating peanut butter chocolate jam. That's awesome. Thanks for the follow. I appreciate that. Hello from Nashville, Tennessee. Hi, Kim. Thanks for being here. What if you guys are new? My name's Ryan. We've been going through the Bible. We go through it expositionally, which just means verse by verse. And we went through the book of Revelation. That is up on YouTube. So if you're interested, you can go and click on my profile picture, and all of these videos I post up online. So you can go to YouTube. I don't edit them or anything like that, but they're up there for you if you are interested in going back and rewatching them. But we went through the book of Revelation. We went through the book of Daniel, which is really neat. That's a really cool book. And then we went through the book of Ruth, and now we are going through the book of John. And we're gonna get into some. We're going to go all over the place, which is not a surprise to you guys who have been here before. We go all over the place, but it's good. We're getting acclimated to a whole bunch of the stuff in the Bible. We're trying to learn and understand and what things are, and I try to break it down as best I can. There's a lot going on, and it hopefully you guys are gaining a better picture of the Bible, because it's not just like we're going through the book of John, but in order you have to go all over and understand what's going on back here. And you're flipping all over the Bible, and that is how you learn. It's really good to chase those threads, pull on them, see where they go, see what they mean, look things up, dive into it, and it's a fun thing to do. Blackbird, hi, I haven't seen you in a while. I am here. Glad you are here, Blackbird. I'm here for it. Good, respiratory. Are you a respiratory... What is that? What's that called in the medical field? Do you work respiratory in the hospital? Seems that them stopping good things right now are a way of life. I'm sorry. Oh, it's okay, Katie. I'm just glad you guys are here. A therapist, respiratory therapist. That's the word. Yes. Thanks, Beth. Words are hard. I'm working now. I listen at work. Awesome. Yeah, absolutely. Carnation for sure. Addiction, heartbreak, trauma, depression, he got you. If you guys have any questions, if like last time I was live, it ended, and I have no idea why, but I was in the middle of having a conversation, I think, with somebody, and it just shut me down. So I did not do that. So if you were here for my last live and I just ended abruptly, I'm sorry, that was not me. I have no idea what happened. It just shut me down, and that was really, really strange. And then after that, I started looking into it, and things weren't really working very well. But it is, we'll get through it. We'll see how it goes. Warfare, yeah, seems like it. Who knows? But so if you like what I meant to say before my last live ended. I always say it all the time, but if you guys ever have any questions about anything you're going through with the Bible, and you have a question, hey, what does this mean? What does this mean? What do you think about this? Feel free to shoot me a direct message on TikTok. Just click on my face and hit message, and you can message me, and I'd love to talk to you. It's fun having conversations, because I learn. There's things that people ask me, and I'm like, oh, I don't know. And then I look into it, but I go into it. You force me to go into it. And that is what I love doing. Force me to get in here, and that sharpens me. And then I can sharpen you, you sharpen me. We're both sharpening each other. And it is a really neat thing. So never feel like it's bothering me, because it is not. But very interesting stuff going on. I don't know if you guys are paying attention to everything going on. You guys probably know stuff I don't. I probably know some stuff you don't. But a little thing that I found interesting that's going on within the last 24 hours is that there was a cyber attack that happened over in Australia, and they basically shut down 4 of their major ports where they bring in all of their goods and whatnot. And it just shows you the power of turning a flashlight or a room. Like you walk into a room and you turn the light on or you turn it off. And that's basically how our world operates. They can turn it off, they can turn it on. And it is crazy to see the power that they have, even with, freedom of, free speech, right? Like I got censored for a video that I put out. They labeled it as misinformation. I got hit with it, whatever. And I'm like, okay, so you're the one who is the judge on what is information and what is misinformation. Good to know, TikTok. I'm just like, whatever. It's just, it's nothing new. It's just, I'm not mad. But It is, it's an interesting thing. Unless it's Katie. Yeah, no, Katie, keep it coming. I do not mind whatsoever. Ryan, do you have a backup account in case something happens? I was actually thinking about that because I don't. I said I should a while ago. I said I should probably make one, and I haven't. It's something I probably should do just in case. Maybe I'll do that here soon. But yeah, that's a good idea. That is a good idea, Jalen. Apparently, a lot of people have backup accounts. Do you guys have backup accounts? Do you guys ever go live, or are you just on here just do the swiping thing like myself? Man, it's easy to get lost and just keep on going. Hi, Christine. How are you doing? How are you feeling? How are you recovering? How's the pain management? Christine had surgery a couple weeks ago, and she is a little, getting kind of banged up a little bit, trying to recover. So hopefully she's doing okay. But keep her in your prayers if you remember it. Man, Victor, what's up, man? Glory be to God. Yes, absolutely. I'm great. My back pain is intense, but doing good. Good. Prayers for my mom too. Yeah, Melly's mom has surgery coming up here in a couple weeks, and that's a scary thing. Just having the thought of a deadline coming up, and I don't know if you guys have ever had surgery before, like where it's major surgery, like whether it be back or knee surgery, but it's a life-changing thing. You go in there, you don't know what's going to happen, all the nerves. So pray for the doctors, pray for the nerves, and pray for everything to heal quickly, because that stuff, there's power in prayer, as we talked about many times, every day, every way. Yeah. But yeah, okay, so we can go ahead and, 3 and 1 years. Oh, 3 surgeries in 1 year. Yoicks. What's up, Nick? Good to see you, buddy. How are you? It definitely is. I tried to fight the nurse once. I was in recovery. Yoicks. Scary and hard recovery prayers. Yeah. Reference, new job. Do I apply or wait in patience? Like God asked. Good, brother. Good, Nick. Good to see you, man. I hope you're staying safe out there. Hopefully it's not getting too crazy. But Melissa, I feel like pray about it. And it's funny because doors will close in a sense. And I feel like it'll be apparent. There was a time where I applied at this one job a couple of years ago, and I wanted it bad. And then I made it all the way through, and then it got shut down right at the end for some bullcrap reason, and I was not happy. But then looking back on it from where I am now, I'm just like, man, I'm glad that didn't work out. But I didn't see it back then, but I do now, and there's clearly a reason for it. Ryan, my twins and I are getting baptized tomorrow. No way. Let's go, Blackbird. That's awesome. You gotta have somebody record that and put that up. That'd be fun to watch. That's so cool. Same thing happened to me, police officer position. Are you a police officer? Melissa Cease? Good evening, Kim. Maybe God had another plan. Yes, he did. Very apparent. Hard to see it going through it, but looking back on it, it was very, very clear that there was a different plan. So very, very neat stuff. But I'm thankful for you guys being here. I just want you guys to know, it's just neat that people are interested in this kind of stuff. And it's fun talking about it because we're all getting sharpened. But yeah, it's good stuff going through this, especially the Gospel of John. But we can go ahead and get started. We're going to do what we normally do just by way of review because it's good to kind of recap. I don't know if you guys were here for our last session, but we went through John chapter 4 and chapter 5. So if you were here for that, it's just going to be a review. If you weren't, I'll try to cover some of the things that we went through like we normally do. If you're new here, can you put a little hand up just because I want to know if there's new people that have never been here before. I wonder If you are new, did you see me on your For You page, or did somebody invite you? How are you here? Hi, Jill. Did somebody invite you, Jill, or Wendy? Yeah, Gina, hi. Did somebody invite you guys here, or For You page? Okay, cool. That's good. At least that lets me know that I'm not too shadow banned. It is what it is. But yeah, no, currently shadow banned as far as my videos are concerned, as the little TikToks that I post. But we can go ahead and dive on into it. But we're just going to start off by going through a little bit of a review. So if you guys have you not been here, we're going to do a review of the first 5 chapters of the book of John. So go ahead and turn to John chapter 20, and we're going to read verse 30 and 31, because this is the reason why. Thanks, Christy. This is the reason. Shelva Fox, what's up? Good to see you. This is the reason why. This is the purpose of John's gospel. John chapter 30. Oh, I'm sorry. John chapter 20, verse 30. It says, John chapter 20, verse 30 and 31, it says, "And truly Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name." So this is why the whole purpose of the Gospel of John. As we talked about before, there are 4 different Gospels. You can talk about Acts being the second version of the Gospel of Luke. But let's go ahead and focus on the main 4, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, right? So Matthew, Mark, and Luke are what is referred to as synoptic Gospels, where it's the same optics and they're seeing the same thing and they're writing the same thing down just in their own perspective. So that's Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But we are in the Gospel of John. John is completely different. There are different miracles that John records that are completely unique to John, where you can't find them in, thanks Respiratory, you can't find them in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And so it's an interesting thing. And just a little bit about who John is, because it's kind of fun to try to relate and understand who this guy is. We just have John, like, who is he? What's going on? But John is the same guy who writes the Gospel of John, he writes 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, and he also writes the book of Revelation. So he writes all 5 of those books, and he is what you would call beloved. So in the New Testament, where we are here, he is the beloved, the disciple whom God loved, or whom Jesus loved, is how John refers to himself here. We haven't got there yet, but in the Old Testament, the beloved person was Daniel. When Gabriel shows up, he says, "Oh, Daniel, greatly beloved." And it's interesting because when you compare Daniel and you compare John, one in the Old Testament, one in the New, they both have apocalyptic visions about what's coming in the future, and they both have those visions, and they're both called beloved, and it's just an interesting connection there. But they're all on the same team. They're all trying to further the gospel. They're all trying to get that ball down the field, and it's all about the same story of Christ. It's all about Christ. It always is. You just need to know how to look at it. It's funny because when you look at Daniel and you go and you see his visions, he really had no idea what he was saying because it was a different time. Whereas when John sees his visions, when he's caught up, he sees things he can probably understand a little bit more because he has he experienced more. So time and perspective is key here. But if you know anything about John, you understand that John likes to use the numbers. He likes to use 7. There's, in the book of Revelation, for example, there's 7 churches, there's 7 seals, there's 7 trumpets, 7 bowl judgments, and there's 7 all over the place. So the same concept is applied here in the Gospel of John. There's also something that is used as a way of a marker. Just imagine like putting like a flag down in a sense, because the word metatauta is constantly used in the book of Revelation, and it's also used in the Gospel of John. John lets you kind of know what's going on by saying metatauta, and metatauta is just the Greek word of saying hereafter or after these things. They are all encapsulated. So metatauta is a style of who John is. The number 7 being used time and time again is also a style of who he is. And it's just something to pay attention to. So there, in the Gospel of John, there are 7 signs, 7 miracles that are used throughout the Gospel of John, and there are 7 different I am. So I am the bread, I am the light, I am the door, I am the good shepherd, I am the resurrection and the life, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and I am the true vine. So that is, those are some of the 7s, but you can find other 7s if you look for them, but it's really neat. John also was a little bit of, he was different than the other ones. We haven't really talked too much on this, but it's an interesting thing to really connect because I know we've mentioned it before, but maybe we can talk about it just before we dive in, just so you can understand a little bit. John had a different level of connection with Jesus. Not saying that Jesus loved him more, but the connection was different. And so it's interesting because Jesus had his own brothers, right? Like there were brothers of Jesus that were his half brothers, obviously. But John was not a brother, but John somehow was able to be... Jesus looked at John and gave John responsibility for Mary. And that's interesting because he didn't give it to his other brothers. He gave the responsibility to John. And that shows a level of, I don't know, friendship, brotherhood, like connection. So it's interesting because when you look at the like when Jesus was boots on the ground, you see different circles, right? You see the inner circle, right, was Peter, James, and John. You see Peter, James, and John. We've talked about this before, but if you missed it, Peter, James, and John were privy to certain things and miracles that Jesus performed, and it was only Peter, James, and John. So you get the idea that they were brought into some kind of things that God wanted them to see themselves, Peter, James, and John. So you get a little idea that there's this little inner circle. So that's the inner circle. But let's zoom out from that and let's talk about the other situation. So basically a way to look at it in a sense is if you zoom all the way out, everywhere Jesus went, there was a massive crowd, right? Like you can find that in all the Gospels. Like these people were following him. So it's just this mass crowd. So now let's zoom in a little bit more. So now we're going to focus on the outer circle, and let's go to Luke chapter 10 real fast. Luke chapter 10, because this is just so you guys can visualize some stuff. But in Luke chapter 10, verse 1, it says this. In Luke chapter 10, verse 1, it says, "After these things, the Lord appointed 70 others also, and sent them 2 by 2 before his face into every city and place where he himself was about to go." And so this is interesting. So you zoom all the way out and you have the crowd, just random people wanting to get in there, right? Like just people who wanted to see what the talk was about. So you have this massive crowd, but then you zoom in a little bit more and now you have the 70. So you have this massive crowd and then you zoom in and now you have the 70. And then after the 70, you have the 12, right? So the 12, you can go to Matthew 10 if you're interested in knowing where that is. Go to Matthew 10 real fast because we saw where the 70 was. So there were 70 people, like a lot. I mean, people don't really understand that, but there were 70 people that were appointed. That's interesting because when you think about this kind of stuff, you just think about the 12. So go to Matthew 10, and in Matthew 10, you will see verse 2 through 4 is where all the 12 disciples are named. Matthew 10, verse 2, it says this: "Now the names of the 12 apostles are these: first, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew his brother, James the son of Zebedee, and John his brother, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the tax collector, James the son of Alphaeus and Lebbaeus, whose surname is Thaddeus, Simon the Canaanite, and Judas Iscariot, who also betrayed him." So those are the 12. Okay, so you have the crowd that follows him. Then you zoom in, now you have the 70, and then you zoom in more, and then you have the 12, and then you zoom in more, and then you find Peter, James, and John, and we'll just go to one. Let's go to Mark 9. let's go to Mark 9 real fast, because you can find Peter, James, and John in multiple places. But we're just going to look at one just so you guys can see it visually. Mark chapter 9, verse 2 and 3. And this is about the transfiguration. This is one of those times where it was this amazing event to where Peter, James, and John had front row seats where the other disciples didn't. Okay, so in Mark chapter 9, verse 2, it says, "Now after 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John and led them up on a high mountain apart from themselves, and he was transfigured before them." Okay, so this is where you get that. Jesus is letting them come in. Okay, so now let's recap that real fast just so you can see it. You have this whole crowd that follows Jesus everywhere he went, right? Like everybody wanted to be around him. Then you zoom in a little bit more, and then you have the outer circle, which was the 70, and then you zoom in a little bit more, and then you have the 12, and then you zoom in a little bit more, and then you have the 3. And so that is basically the surrounding situation of what was going on. So if you're interested, that might help you out a little bit on visualizing how things were working. We didn't really talk about it, or at least we talked about it a little bit here and there, but there you can have those verses to kind of understand that stuff. Hi, KB, how are you? We are in, we're just starting, we're just doing a review. We haven't even really started the review. We've kind of started a way of review, but now we're going to start with the review. That was just that was the review of the review. Now we're going to go to John chapter 1, and we'll go over John chapter 1 because we unpacked this a little bit, but just a aerial view of what we already covered. And all of this stuff is up on YouTube if you guys are interested, if you're wanted to go look into that. But in John chapter 1, it parallels, in a sense, Genesis chapter 1. In Genesis chapter 1, it says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth," right? So, and now you have the beginning of or you're in the New Testament, and it says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." So it's interesting because in Genesis 1:1, you have, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth," which is time, space, and matter, all brought into the first verse there. And in Genesis 1:1, it says, "In the beginning, God." In the beginning, God is Elohim in the Hebrew. So Elohim, anytime you see I am, Elohim, H-I-M, so it's E-L-O-H-I-M. Anytime there's I am at the end of a Hebrew word, it makes it plural. And that's important to understand. So you have in the beginning God, which is a plural word. It sounds singular, but it's plurality behind it. So that's really neat. It gives you a insight, a little understanding. If you were Hebrew, if you were Jewish, you could understand that a little bit better. It would make more sense to you. You wouldn't. So like, that's interesting, right? Like you need to think how Jewish people think. This is a Jewish Bible, and we translated it over into our world, and now we're just trying to unpack and catch up to what they should already see. But they missed Jesus. They still don't believe that he is the Messiah. They're still looking for one, which is mind-blowing. We're going to talk about that tonight. But anyways, in John 1:1, it says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." You could also word that first verse there that says, "Before the world was created, the Word already existed." And that's interesting. The word word there means logos, and this is a title, because if you go to Psalm 138 verse 2, it talks about how he puts his word above everything, essentially, and that's really, really neat when you start making all of these different connections. So then you go down and you are introduced to John the Baptist. John the Baptist was basically the end of the Old Testament. If you go to Luke 16:16, it says that the Old Testament and the law were until John the Baptist. And so basically, it says the law and the prophets were until John the Baptist. And so John the Baptist basically wraps up the Old Testament. So the Old Testament ends with John the Baptist. So John the Baptist, he is not the bridegroom. He is not the bride. He is a friend of the bride. And so that's important to understand. John the Baptist basically sealed that up, and everything after John was a different stage or dispensation, if you will. And that's important to understand, just for aerial viewpoint purposes. But then you get to John chapter 1, verse 11, 12, and 13, and it says, he came to his own, and his own did not receive him. But as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God. And this is amazing, because when you understand what children of God is, it is a direct creation by God himself. And so I want you to imagine, like, I'm over here building like little stick figures, right? Like I made like 2 stick figures. Now these 2 stick figures, I made myself. This is a direct creation by me, right? But if I gave them to you, it's not your creation. I created it, right? So this is the same concept with God. So with you have a direct creation. Every time you see all the angels, for example, all of the angels, whether they're good or bad, are sons of God because they are a direct creation by God. Adam was a direct creation by God. He is called a son of God. You and I are called a son of man. And so this verse in John chapter 1, verse 12 is amazing, because when you accept Christ as your personal Savior, you become a child of God. And I can't, this verse just blows my mind. I know I talk about it all the time. Every time we do a review, I talk on this verse because it just, my imagination just goes crazy, because you can just, sheesh, what's up, man? How you doing, Chosen? But it's really interesting, because there is something that happens internally that we have no idea. What's going on? I don't know, but there is a transformation that happens spiritually, and it's so cool to just imagine. Use your imagination. What happens? Is it just like this blasting form of like light just shining? I have no idea. But there clearly is something that happens that we cannot fully grasp. We can't really grasp everything, and that is important to understand as well. But in verse 14 of John chapter 1, it says, and the word became flesh and dwelt among us. The word dwelt there means tabernacled. He tabernacled among us. He lived among us. That's amazing, because when you go back and you unpack everything about the tabernacle, it was a portable dwelling place for God. They were able to make it pop up the tent. They were able to tear it down, move it wherever they needed to, put it back up again. And they did that time and time again, and that was a tabernacle. And then the tabernacle turned into a temple, which was built by King Solomon. King Solomon's temple was destroyed by King Nebuchadnezzar. And then Zerubbabel built another temple that was destroyed by the Romans. And now we are living in this world where you and I are unique to everything that's happened in the past. And it is so stinking neat that you and I have the Holy Spirit, whereas that did not apply back in the Old Testament. And we need to understand that. There's people who say, oh, I wish I could go back and see David or Daniel or whatever. And I'm just thinking, they would rather be where you are right now. They would rather be able to have everything that you and I have here and be able to dive into this, because they didn't have it. You and I do, and we don't treat it like it's gold. We walk around and we just throw this thing around, like we don't realize what we had. There's stories about people, they were playing, there was these little kids that were playing with shiny stones, and the kids were just like playing, throwing them around, doing stuff with it. And then somebody took a closer look and they realized that the kids were playing with diamonds, and they had no idea that the kids were playing with diamonds because the kids didn't know what they had. And so that's the same concept with the world today. We do not know what we have here. This is an absolute gold mine, and we don't treat it as such. But we need to change our mind. We need to train our minds to think differently. You've been wired your whole life to think up is down, or up is up and down. Like everything's wrong. We need to rewire and reprogram our brains in order for us to see the world for how it truly is. It's important to do it. It takes a lot of work. But after you do, you're going to start looking at the world and you're going to be like, this whole world is upside down, because it is. It is crazy. And I'm sure you guys already know what I'm talking about, but it is mind blowing. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. So then you get to John chapter 1, where the Jews sent these priests to go check out John the Baptist, and they're like, who are you? They're trying to figure out who he is. And it's important to understand that the Jews are always looking for 3 people and that were predicted. They were looking for the Messiah, they were looking for Elijah, and they were looking for Moses. And we covered all of those verses And that's what they were doing. And John's like, I'm not any one of those. And so it's just funny how the Jewish people were like, what's going on? Because the Jewish people don't want somebody coming in and taking their authority or taking their power or making people doubt them. And so they are going to push back because they want to hold on to their power at all costs. But then you get into John chapter 2, and in John chapter 2, it's a really, really neat chapter because it talks about the Galilean wedding. And we did a pretty deep dive on this chapter because of what it says in chapter 2 verse 6, where it says, "Now there were set six water pots of stone according to the manner of purification of the Jews." So the manner of purification of the Jews is really interesting because we went to Numbers chapter 19, and in Numbers chapter 19 it talked about a red heifer, what they had to do. They had to bring a red heifer in, they had to burn the entire thing, take the ashes of a red heifer, and then add that stuff to water, and whatever happened within that process was what they cleansed themselves with. It was a cleansing purification process, and it's a really interesting thing, but it almost foreshadows it's almost in a sense a type of Christ. You can make that argument. You can see it because the red heifer was without blemish. There was no yoke ever set on top of it. But anyways, the Galilee wedding, that Jewish culture is in a sense a picture of Jesus and you and I, because what they would do is the man would go up to the woman. This is all in the Jewish culture. The Jewish man would go up to the Jewish woman. He'd propose, and then the Jewish man would go away. The Jewish bride had to be constantly ready. She had no idea when he was going to come back. And that's a picture of what you and I need to be with Christ, because we have no idea when he's going to come back. But we better be ready. And so that's the whole thing. He goes away to prepare a place. He comes back, and then he takes his bride away for 7 days to consummate the marriage, and then returns. And it's just this whole picture about the entire end times process, which the 7-year tribulation, the millennial kingdom. It's a wonderful, wonderful picture. But that's what's going on in John chapter 2. And then you move on after John chapter 2, and we talked about how there are some people who think that Jesus did miracles when he was a child. I think there's actually a TV show out there. But in John chapter 2, verse 11, it says, "This beginning of signs Jesus did in Cana of Galilee and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him." So it tells you right there that this is the beginning of signs. So, that's just Hollywood doing what it does by, pushing out a TV show out there. And you need to be careful with anything that says Jesus on it. And because they come at you, like, think about Satan. Like, I'm not saying anything about these TV shows. I'm just trying to get you to think. You need to learn how to think, because if you understand what Satan does, he'll approach you as an angel of light, right? He will approach you as an angel of light, meaning he's going to come at you the way you want to be approached. He's going to show up and he's going to smile. He's going to give you a nice little hug. He's going to do those things. He's not going to, because you would react completely differently if he came at you and was like, so he's smart. He's highly intelligent, and he's going to approach you as an angel of light. And so you need to be on guard all the time, and myself included. So that is important to understand with those TV shows where they say Jesus this, Jesus that. Just understand that those TV shows are not gospel. It is a broad interpretation of what the Bible says. So anyways, moving on in John chapter 3. In John chapter 3, it is, we talk about Nicodemus. Nicodemus approaches Jesus by night, and Nicodemus says, "We know that you are a teacher sent from God," because of all the things that Jesus was doing. And it's interesting that Nicodemus approaches Jesus at night, because that is what you would do if you don't want people to see you. And so it's an interesting concept. But when he says "we know," that implies that there could be a private group that Nicodemus was a part of. Nicodemus seems to be a thinking kind of guy who was truly searching, and he saw Jesus. He saw what he did. It didn't make sense. He saw all the testimonies, the woman that was made well. What's going on? He's trying to figure it out himself. And that's what we should be doing. Nicodemus, understand, he was the teacher of Israel, and he was the one who was supposed to be leading all of the other younger Jewish people. But he himself was conflicted because he sees Jesus. He's like, wait a second, we need to be doing this, but this guy's doing all of these things. He wants to know more about Jesus, and he's like, who are you? He's trying to figure out who Jesus is. And understand, during this time, the Jewish people were completely like Jesus was showing up and undoing everything. Can you imagine living your entire life? Imagine you're 70 years old and you lived your life the entire same way by doing all the law, doing the law, all the sacrifices. And then one day you're like, hey, don't do that anymore. We don't have to. You'd be like, what? Like you would short circuit your brain almost because of how crazy this is. You're like, wait a second. We had to do all of this for my entire life. What do you mean we don't have to because Jesus died? Yeah, well, that's what Jesus was doing. The reason why Jesus was doing all of these wonderful miracles and signs and wonders and whatnot was because he was here to change things up. And in order to get everybody's attention, he had to do all of these things. And that's the same concept with why the disciples had to do everything, because they were trying to get the ball rolling. They were trying to get the church started. So that's why the signs, the miracles, all of those things needed to occur, because they needed to get everybody's attention. It's interesting because the book of Acts, it's like everybody wants to experience Acts, whereas instead of teach the experiences, it's a complete backwards situation there almost. But in John chapter 3, it says in verse 14 and 15, it says that Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, and even so must the Son of Man be lifted up. And it's crazy because if you go back and you unpack that, you understand that Moses basically, like the Israelites were getting bit by these poisonous snakes back in the book of Numbers, and they were all dying. And so Moses goes before the Lord, and God tells him to do something that does not make any sense. If you go back to the book of Numbers and you see what God told Moses to do, it doesn't make any sense. God could have said, you know what? Boom, done. Don't even worry about it. I fixed it. He could have said, all right, everybody just sleep for 3 hours. No, he didn't do any of that. What he told Moses was to do was to put a serpent on a rod and lift it up, and anybody who looked at it would be saved or healed, or they wouldn't die. And it's a beautiful, beautiful picture, but it doesn't make sense for anybody reading the Bible until right here in John 3, 14 and 15, because Jesus himself references it, and now it makes sense. There was like 1,000 years to where nobody probably knew what the heck was going on when Moses did that. Everybody's like, what the heck is going on? I have no idea. Why did God tell Moses to put a serpent on a snake and everybody look at it? And so all of a sudden he did, and nobody understood why until right here in John 3. And so John 3 is where Jesus references that, and he's talking about what Jesus is going to happen to himself. And it's so stinking neat. And then it follows up with the most important verse in the entire Bible, arguably, which is John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. And it's important to understand that the word have there in John 3:16 is present tense, meaning you have it now. You don't have to wait to get it. You have it right now. And it is so neat. And that's what's so cool about the Greek and Hebrew language. When you go back to it, you need to understand that they have tenses. Like, is it past tense, present tense, or future tense? Like, understand, dive in, figure those things out. Like, click on things and have fun with it. It's really, really neat. But that's what's going on there. But then in John 3, verse 22, it says, after these things, and that's where you're introduced to John's style, metatauta. You are introduced to John kind of writing. This is how he talks. Metatauta, John 3:22. It says metatauta, and then when you parallels with Revelation, because in Revelation 1:19 and Revelation 4:1, it says it starts out those verses, or the word metatauta is within those verses and throughout the book of Revelation, and that's really neat. So you're getting a little style of who this guy is, and this is just how he talks. So it's kind of cool. But then you get to John chapter 4. And in John chapter 4, you are basically, you're introduced to where Jesus basically arranges a meeting with a Samaritan woman. And we talked about the Samaritans because we unpacked this quite a bit, but there's a battle going on between the Samaritans and the Jewish people, and it goes all the way back to the Old Testament, and we unpacked a lot of that kind of stuff. So the Old Testament, there was King Solomon. After King Solomon died, there was, so you remember the 12 tribes of Israel? Well, those 12 tribes, they broke up, and 10 of them went to the northern kingdom, and that northern kingdom was called Israel. So Israel is up here, and then there are 2 tribes that remained down south in the southern kingdom, which was called Judah. And these 2 tribes down here were composed of Benjamin and Judah. And out of the line of Judah was where David came from, which is where the line that Jesus came from. And so anyways, you have the 12 tribes, they split up, and the 10 tribes up here, these guys were bad news bears. They allowed all kinds of idolatry to enter their lifestyle. So they were Jewish people that now adopted all kinds of nonsense into their world, and then they were eventually defeated by the Assyrians. So the Assyrians came in, and they're like, you know what, we're going to start, they mingled with the Assyrian women, and they basically became half Jews over time, half Jews, half Jews, half Jews. It just kept on dividing, and they kept getting further and further away from their own law that they should have been following. And so as time continued, now all of a sudden you have these guys that are called Samaritans, which they used to be related. They used to be friends, allies, and then you just see the divide as when sin enters into the game, there comes this great division. That is what is going on. So now you have the Samaritans, which came from the northern kingdom, and they hated the Jewish people. And so anyways, Jesus in John chapter 4, Jesus arranges this meeting to meet a Samaritan at a well. And she was a Samaritan. She was supposed to hate Jesus because Jesus was a Jew. Jesus was supposed to hate the Samaritan because she was a Samaritan. But here you have this beautiful meeting that was flung into existence before the world was even, it was, I mean, Jesus knew the timing of everything is absolutely phenomenal. But anyways, Jesus meets this woman, and he starts talking to her, and there are 6 different times that the woman speaks, and there are 7 different times that Jesus speaks, but Jesus basically says all these things to her. We talked about this for a while, but this was some really neat stuff. And we unpacked a lot of the geography going on there just so you could visualize it. But anyways, it's funny because the woman ended up running away and telling the entire city about Jesus, and that was the opposite of what should have happened. Because let's go back to the Jews. Remember in John chapter 1, he came unto his own, and his own received him not. Who were his own? His own were the Jewish people. The Jewish people did not accept Jesus. And then Jesus does what doesn't make any sense, and he goes to the Samaritan people, and the Samaritans come out to meet him because the word of the woman. This woman, thanks Megan, you compare the woman, the Samaritan woman, to Nicodemus, right? Nicodemus was the Jewish teacher. He should have been like, everybody follow Jesus, but he didn't. He was afraid. He had all of these different things that he was worried about happening. Thanks, Megan. But then you have on the flip side, you have this Samaritan woman who shouldn't have done anything that she did, and then goes and tells everybody. And I love the picture because everybody comes out to Jesus, and it says in John chapter 4, verse 39. In John chapter 4, verse 39, it says, "And many of the Samaritans of the city believed in him because of the word of the woman who testified." Wow. This woman, remember, this woman had probably less than an hour conversation with Jesus. And after that hour, her mind was blown. She believed. She didn't get baptized, mind you. She did not get baptized during this time. Baptism doesn't save you guys. She ran away and told everybody, and then people came out to see him. And they believed because of her. That is so powerful, and that's the same concept I'm trying to tell you guys. Like, if you've been here at all, you know that I want you to just go out and tell somebody about Jesus. You don't know where they're at. You don't know what kind of things they're dealing with mentally or physically or spiritually. You don't know where they are. And you could be that light, and you could be like, hey, can I tell you about Jesus? I don't know much, but I want to tell you about what I do know. And that is so stinking cool because they believed because of her. And they came out, and then they believed because of what they saw. And that is so cool. I love it. I love it. We talked about it. I could keep on talking about it. I'm probably going to keep on talking about it. I'm just going to keep... No. Okay. So that is what is going on in John chapter 4, at least for the most part. But then also we continued on. Jesus heals a nobleman's son. That guy, we talked about how the nobleman, he came to Jesus. His son was in Capernaum, and Jesus and the nobleman were in Cana. And the nobleman comes up to Jesus here. Jesus says, "Hey, your son's made well." The dad didn't even go home to check. He just believed. He's like, "You know what? I believe you." It wasn't until later when the servants found him, he's like, "Hey, your son's made well." And he just inquires about the hour. And it was the same hour that Jesus said that his son would be made well. Now that is belief, and it's fascinating. So that is what's going on there. But then we get to John chapter 5. And John chapter 5, I talked about this for a minute, because this is it's an interesting thing to really unpack. But in John chapter 5, you're introduced to this pool of Bethesda, and we talked about how in Nehemiah chapter 3, there around Jerusalem, there are 10 different gates around Jerusalem. Okay, here gate. But in John chapter 5 verse 2, this whole situation is happening right up here. So if this is the gates, or if this is the walls, here is the sheep gate up at the northeast corner. And that is where this whole setting is happening. But Jesus goes and he basically hunts down this one individual. Same concept as what he did with the woman at the well. He makes an arrangement with the Samaritan woman so that the word could spread about Jesus Christ. That's what he was doing. He was spreading the gospel. He was doing his thing. Same concept here in chapter 5. Jesus goes and he hunts down this dude who is sitting at this pool. And it's a really interesting conversation when you really start to look at this pool. And I gave you guys a different way to look at it. And I'm not going to be dogmatic about it because I don't know myself. But I told you that, take this as a grain of salt, but it's a different way. But the information that I gave you guys was that this pool is interesting because you have this guy who was not well. He couldn't move. And there is this pool to where anybody who walked into it when the water started getting all crazy would be healed. And so the way I told it, the way I went about it was, it's very, very interesting because first off, John chapter 5 verse 4 was added. It was an explanatory verse that was added to the text to kind of help out kind of whatever. And that's interesting to think about that, which is why it's important to go back to the original text, because remember, the English version is not original. We're not reading original stuff here. This is a translation of the original. So go back to the Hebrew, go back to the Greek, study that. That is vital to understand. But this verse 4, is not there. And basically what you see in verse 4, it says, "For an angel went down at a certain time into the pool." And basically he stirred up the water, and whoever was in there first got healed. That doesn't make any sense to me from everything I know about the Bible. Doesn't make any sense. And I'm just going to tell you this. And this is what I want you to understand. Take it as a grain of salt, because I'm not sure. I'm not being dogmatic about it. But nowhere in the Bible do you see an angel doing miracles and healing people, right? So you can look at this kind of situation almost in a demonic kind of lens if you try, because it doesn't really make any sense. Now, hear me out. So an angel stirs up the water and now somebody is healed, but it's only the first person, right? That's opposite of what we know, right? The first shall be last. This doesn't coincide with what you know about the scripture. So it's interesting. This verse is very interesting. There could have been spiritual things going on there. Now, remember, Jesus is God at all times. Here's an interesting thought, just because we're talking about spiritual things. You know how Judas, right? Judas betrays Jesus, and Satan entered Judas, right? So can you imagine the vision that Jesus could see? Like you and I, like you're looking at me right now, you see what I look like. Imagine what Jesus saw when he saw Judas. Like it's a spiritual situation going on, right? Like he knew that Satan was there. How? Well, he's God. He could see that kind of stuff. It's the same concept. He knows what's going on, and he has control of it all at the same time. He's in complete control. My mind's blown just thinking about it. But anyways, he goes here to this pool, and there is an angel, and whoever was first, the survival of the fittest, which doesn't make sense at all. doesn't fit what you know about the gospel, is now stirring up the water, and whoever gets there first is going to get healed. So anyways, Jesus goes and he and it goes back to the same, just with the whole demonic thing, the water. These people were putting their faith in water, right? So they wanted to go into the water. They wanted to go into the water. Jesus shows up. He's like, it's not about the water. It's about me. And I love it. I love the picture. Same thing with the staff that Moses had where the serpent was on it. Everybody wanted to touch the rod. And then when you go to 1 Kings, this guy named Hezekiah actually goes and he breaks it because he was like, everybody, you're not supposed to be worrying about the staff of Moses. You're supposed to be worried about the things of God. And it's a really neat thing to kind of see that kind of stuff. But it's just a thought. I'm just giving you ways to think about it. It's kind of like with the Shroud of Turin, like where it's Jesus, they say that it's Jesus's clothes or something like that, or whatever. I could care less. Like I might look at it, yeah, but I'm not going to worship it. And so Jesus shows up, he goes to the guy, he singles him out. He's like, hey, I'm going to heal you. And it was quite an event, but that's what goes on in John chapter 5. And, we talked about how there's different resurrections that were mentioned. There was 2 different resurrections, which is also talked about in the book of Revelation. It says, blessed is he who takes part in the first resurrection. If you are born twice, then you die once. And if you're born once, then you die twice. And it is a scary thing. You want to make sure that you are born twice. And that is what Nicodemus was having a hard time wrapping his little itty bitty mind around, because he's like, am I supposed to go back into my mother's womb? No, that's not. He was talking about spiritual things. So that is basically what we talked about, and that is just a quick review of the first 5 chapters. But to end that, Jesus talks about how there were 4 different witnesses of who he was. We talked about how it needs to be a minimum of 2 witnesses at all times. We unpack that because you can go to that is talked about multiple different places, but in the book of Numbers and the book of Deuteronomy mentions that a minimum of 2 witnesses are required. Well, here in John chapter 5, it ends the chapter by giving you 4 witnesses. You have the first witness, which is John the Baptist. You have the second witness, which is Jesus's works. You have the third witness, which is the Father. And then you have the fourth one, which is the Scriptures, which arguably is the biggest witness of who Jesus is. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word became God, and the Word was with God. Like it is, it all comes back, wraps together, a complete circle. It is unbelievable. So that is a little bit of a review of John chapter 1 through 5. So hopefully if you guys weren't here for any of those chapters, that kind of catches you guys up into what we already covered. And then we will be going into John chapter 6 and 7 here, and we'll be diving into that. So it's going to be interesting. So hopefully that was cleared things up for you. So in John chapter 5 holds some of the strongest arguments for the deity of Christ. But we get to John chapter, thank you, I missed a good chunk of the last one's good. Hopefully that's good. Reviews really, really help drill it in, and that is what is important to do. So that's good. That's why I like doing the reviews too. Sometimes I do not as in-depth. Sometimes I do in-depth ones, and that one was kind of an in-depth one. So hopefully that helps. But in John chapter 6, you have John chapter 6 is basically one 24-hour period. And in chapter 6, this chapter occurs about around 1 year after chapter 5. So we kind of teleport into time from where John chapter 5 occurs, and now we're in John chapter 6. And this chapter is essentially one day, one 24-hour period situation going on here in John chapter 6. And this is a long this is a long chapter. I mean, there are 71 verses in this chapter. So we are going to just go ahead and get right into it. But in John chapter 6, verse 1, it says, after, right? So it says, after, metatauta, again, after these things. You are right in John's style. Here comes another flag, right? John says, metatauta. Now you know there's another marker. It's very interesting. Once you start seeing it, you'll just start picking up on your own. But in John chapter 6, verse 1, it says, after these things, Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. So the Sea of Galilee, Sea of Tiberias, same thing. So it says the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. So I don't know why it worded it the same way, just or a different way, same thing. But in verse 2, it says, then a great multitude followed him because they saw his signs, which he performed on those who were diseased. And Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat with his disciples. Now the Passover, a feast of the Jews, was near. Now we already talked about the Passover, all right? So it's just letting us know what's coming up. It's kind of setting the scene, what's going on. But we talked about the Passover. We're going to get into that here when we get into John chapter 7. But we're going to unpack and kind of do a little bit deeper dive on some of the feasts of the Lord. There's 7 of them. We'll kind of talk about them, and so we can kind of gain a little bit of an understanding on what they all are. But it's interesting, right? Like, it's a detail there in verse 4. It says, now the Passover, a feast of the Jews, was near. Interesting, right? Like, they're just giving you some context here. So that's what you have. But then it moves on, and it goes on to say in verse 5, it says, then Jesus lifted up his eyes, and seeing a great multitude coming toward him, he said to Philip, where shall we buy bread, that these may eat? And now this is interesting, because we are about to get into where he feeds the 5,000. And this is one of the few incidents that is actually recorded in all 4 Gospels. Remember how we talked about there's 7 miracles in the Gospel of John that is unique to... there's 5 out of the 7 that are unique to John. And if you guys are interested in what those are, or maybe there's 6 out of the 7, but those miracles that are recorded only by John is where Jesus turns the water into wine. He heals the nobleman's son. He heals the crippled man at Bethsaida. He heals the man born blind. He raises Lazarus from the dead, and Jesus guides the disciples to catch a ton of fish, which is at the end. So that's just interesting when you look at it. Those are the ones that are unique to John himself. But here in John chapter 6, verse 5, it says, then Jesus lifted up his eyes. And we're going to start talking about the feeding of the 5,000, this is recorded in the other Gospels. But it's interesting because when you start unpacking this kind of stuff, when you start reading the book of John, the Gospel of John, it's almost as if John himself assumes that you read already Matthew, Mark, and Luke because of some of the things that he says. He almost feels like he doesn't need to tell you things because it's already implied that you understand it. And it's just an interesting thing when you start to see that kind of stuff. But anyways, in John chapter 6, verse 5, it says, then Jesus lifted up his eyes. And so if you guys I don't know what kind of app you guys use, but if you type in your Bible app, if you type in lifted up his eyes, that phrase right there is kind of letting you know that something significant is about to happen, right? And so that is an interesting thing. So pay attention to it. Just, there's patterns. Remember how you and I think about prophecy. We think there is a prediction and then there is a fulfillment. That is how you and I think. We are Gentiles. We are not Jewish people. But Jewish people, if you were to ask a Jew, hey, what's prophecy? They would say pattern. There's patterns going on. So anyways, here in verse 5, lifted up his eyes. Pay attention to those things. Those are patterns. It says then in verse 5, it says, then Jesus lifted up his eyes, and seeing a great multitude coming toward him, he said to Philip. Now, it's interesting that he said it to Philip. Why Philip? Philip was not one of the guys on the inner circle. You remember, we talked about the inner circle. You have the crowd that followed him everywhere. Then you have the 70, and then you have the 12, and then you have the 3, Peter, James, and John. Philip is not a part of the inner circle, but now here you see Philip getting singled out. There are people out there who think that Philip was kind of the leader of the other group, right? So you have Peter, James, and John, and then you have the rest, the other 9, right? Because there's 12 disciples. So there are people who say that they think that Philip could have possibly been a type of leader within the other 9 of those 12 disciples. So anyways, but he singles Philip out and he says, "Where shall we buy bread that these may eat?" But this he said to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. And it's interesting that it adds that little comment, right? Like, of course we know that Jesus already knows what he's going to do, but he still asks people. He's who do they say that I am? Who do you say that I am? Like, he knows these things. He's still having dialogue. He asks these guys questions. It's just interesting. But in verse 6 it says, "But this he said to test him, for he himself knew what he would do." And then in verse 7 it says, "Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may have a little." Now, a denarii was the Roman coin, which was basically what you would be given for a day's wage. So a day's wage, you would be given a denarii, and that's a little coin for working the day. That's not that much. So here in verse 7, where it says 200 denarii, that is almost the equivalent of an 8 months pay back then. So 8 months pay is what he's saying here in verse 7, where it says, "Philip answered and said, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them." Okay, so he's basically saying 8 months pay is not worth, or is not even sufficient for them, that every one of them may have a little. And so then we get to verse 8, and it says, "One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, 'There is a lad here who has five barley loaves and 2 small fish. But what are they among so many?'" And so this is what's interesting about Andrew, because Andrew is a really, really neat character. I love this guy because he is always bringing someone to Jesus. If you pay attention to where Andrew is, he's bringing, if you look close enough to the story, Andrew is bringing somebody to Jesus. And that's what I want to do. Like, I want to bring somebody to Jesus and be like, "Hey, I just want to bring somebody to Jesus." You don't want to show up empty-handed, but it's fascinating. Every time Andrew is mentioned, it seems that he is always bringing someone to Jesus. But in verse 9, this is the guy that he's bringing. He said, "There is a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish, but what are they among so many?" So Andrew, this disciple, brings up this kid and was like, "Hey, I got a kid here. I found him. I don't know where his parents are, but I got this kid here. He's got fish and bread." No, but it's interesting because in the Gospel of John, it says in verse 9, it says, "There is a lad here who has 5 barley loaves." This is an interesting connection, because if you read the other Gospels, they don't mention that it's a lad. They don't say it's a kid. They just say that there's someone here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. But John here emphasizes on the kid. It's a kid. It's a lad or a kid. And John's the only one who actually hones in on that little detail. I don't know why. I don't know why he would do that. But now we know, because of the Gospel of John, that it was someone was a child. It was a lad. It was a small boy who had 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. And then he says, "But what are they among so many?" Then Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there wasn't much grass in the place, so the men sat down in number about 5,000. Now, obviously, it says in verse 10, it says, "So the men sat down." Now, there's more than 5,000 here. The Bible just says the feeding of the 5,000, but it's just counting the men. So if you assume that every man had a woman and every woman had a child, then you have 3. So 3 times 5,000 is 15,000. So there could be somewhere around 15,000 people here, because it only hones in on the men. But it's interesting here in verse 10. It says in verse 10, "Then Jesus said, 'Make the people sit down.' And then it says, now there was much grass in the place." So if you go to Mark 6:39, let's go there real fast. Mark 6:39. Oh, I turned right to it. In Mark 6, Mark chapter 6, verse 39, just so you guys can understand. Remember, this miracle is recorded in all the other Gospels. But in Mark 6:39, we're going to see it from Mark's point of view. And it says in Mark 6:39, it says, "Then he commanded them to make them all sit down in groups on the green grass." So that's interesting. Why is he telling us what color the grass is? It's interesting because in John it just says, sit down on the grass. But Mark emphasized on the green. Now you could dive into that and try to find that and chase it and say, why is Mark doing this? Maybe it's just his style of writing. Maybe he was more descriptive. You could go in and try to understand. But I just want you guys to see that we are getting a story from his point of view. And then you see Mark's point of view. Mark emphasized on something else that John didn't, and John emphasized on something that Mark didn't. John talked about that it was a kid. Mark didn't say that, but Mark said that the grass was green. John didn't say that. You're seeing the connection there, or the compare and contrast there. So they're sitting down. You have 5,000 men sitting down. In verse 11, it says, "And Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to the disciples, and the disciples to those sitting down, and likewise of the fish, as much as they wanted." Now, this is interesting because, in the very first part of verse 11, it says, "And Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks." This is why, this is one of the reasons why we pray before we eat, because Jesus did. I don't know if you guys knew that, but right here you see Jesus gave thanks. That's an interesting connection, right? So my question to you is, when you are about to eat, do you just start diving in, or do you give thanks, right? Give thanks. That is what we should be doing, giving thanks, because that's food that has been provided for you. And you might think that you're the one who is doing all of that stuff, but you could see it differently. But it's interesting. So he gave thanks, and then he distributed them to the disciples, and then the disciples to those sitting down. So the disciples were the ones doing the work here, right? So everybody's sitting down. You have 12 dudes walking around. Can you imagine how long this took? First off, this is a story that we are hearing, and you can just keep on reading, and it's not going to take you that long to read. But when you imagine being one of those people in the 5,000, imagine you're one of those people that are sitting in that crowd, and you're just like, there's 12 dudes that are holding this food out. It's going to be forever. I was in line at McDonald's, and there's 4 cars in front of me for my black coffee that I always get, and I'm like, come on. No, but you understand what I'm saying. The patience that these guys had to, and also the trust. This bucket, these guys are holding these baskets and they're carrying around. Imagine being one of the disciples, because this is going to directly impact the disciples while they're doing this, right? So as they're walking around with the basket, now I think these baskets were big. Everybody would take something out, right? It's taking out. Now just go with me here, but was it just right when one left, another one just manifested? What did this look like? I don't understand. It's crazy, but this is one of those miracles. They're walking around with these baskets, and every time everybody would get whatever they wanted, and it was just a never-ending, it was a all-you-can-eat buffet line at the Golden Corral, just whatever you want. What is going on? But can you imagine it now that you're there in the crowd? Now imagine being one of the disciples holding the baskets, because you're holding this, everybody's getting everything they want, and the basket is still maintaining everything. It's crazy. Colombian coffee, yeah. But this is interesting. So it ends in verse 11. It says, to those sitting down, it says, and likewise of the fish, as much as they wanted. Now, you're getting a connection here. Everyone was filled. And that's neat, because that's going to come into play. So in verse 12, it says, so when they were filled, he said to his disciples, gather up the fragments that remain, so that nothing is lost. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I want you to pay attention to that. It says nothing is lost. You can put brackets around that little phrase, nothing is lost, because that is interesting. That is very, for me, that is interesting wording right there, right? So if I have you come over and we got a Thanksgiving dinner and we're eating, we all get full, and then you're about to leave, I'm not going to be like, hey, gather up. I might say, hey, let's go ahead and throw this in the fridge. I'm not going to say, so nothing is lost. Again, that is there for a reason. Nothing is lost. That's going to come into play. So let's go ahead and skip over to John 6, verse 39 here. It's going to be go to verse 39. In verse 39 of the same chapter, John 6:39, it says, "This is the will of the Father who sent me, that of all he has given me, I should lose nothing, but should raise it up at the last day." This is the connection. We're going to bring this back. So John 6, verse 12 and John 6, verse 39, you're seeing nothing is lost, and I should lose nothing. And this is an interesting thing. So in verse 12, Jesus says, gather up the fragments that remain so that nothing is lost. We're going to be talking about some security issues because I am one of those people that believe if you are saved, then you are saved. You're not losing your salvation. That's where I'm at. I understand that there are people who think you can lose your salvation. And, I'm not one of those people, Katie. And so this is one of those things. Nothing is lost. We're going to talk about this some more. But in verse 13, though, it goes on and it says, "Therefore they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with the fragments of the 5 barley loaves, which were left over by those who had eaten." And here you go. So now you're seeing the picture is becoming more clear. You have these 12 disciples. And it says, they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with the fragments of the 5 barley loaves, which were left over by those who had eaten. So now you have 12 additional baskets. And this is the connection. So pay attention to the 12. So if you go back to the Old Testament, the shade. Go back, the number 12, right? So last time we went over this, we talked about the guy who was 38 years old, and you chase that down. There's the word 38 is only mentioned one other time, and Deuteronomy had to do with the wanderings in the wilderness. But here, now you have 12 baskets, right? So it says, therefore they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets. So let's go back to the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, in the tabernacle, when you walked in to the tabernacle, on your left was the menorah, which was a candle, like basically lampstand with 7 different candles. And that was emblematic. Some people say it's the churches. Some say it's the 7 spirits of God. But on the right, there's a table there with showbread. So you have 12 pieces of showbread, which represent the 12 tribes. So now you have 12 tribes in the Old Testament, and now you have 12 disciples, and now you have 12 baskets. You see the 12, 12, 12, 12, 12. Like, it's all over the place. And it's really neat when you start paying attention. But this is all idiomatic of Jewishness. Right? This is all Jewishy, if you will. So that is, I just find that fascinating. So in verse 14, moving on though, it says, "Then those men, when they had seen the sign that Jesus did, said, 'This is truly the prophet who is come into the world.'" Now, we talked about this before in John chapter 1, because when John the Baptist was out teaching, the Jewish people sent priests to go hunt John the Baptist down and be like, "Hey, John the Baptist, are you the Messiah? Like, who are you?" They were wondering who he was. And we talked about how they are looking for the prophet because they asked about Moses. So go to Deuteronomy 18:15 so we can talk about this for a second, or talk about it again, because we already talked about this. But Deuteronomy 18, verse 15, because in John 6, verse 14, your Bible should have a capital P, prophet, and it's capital P, right? So what's that about? So in Deuteronomy 18, verse 15, it says, "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your midst, from your brethren. Him you shall hear according to all you desired of the Lord your God in Horeb, in the day of the assembling, saying, 'Let me not hear again the voice of the Lord my God, nor let me see this great fire anymore, lest I die.' And the Lord said to me, 'What they have spoken is good. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brethren, and will put my words in his," capital H, "his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. And it shall be that whoever will not hear my words, which he speaks in my name, I will require it of him." Interesting stuff. So that's what the whole prophet situation is going on there in Deuteronomy 18:15. So that's the prophet. So they're saying truly this is the prophet. Interesting. They are acknowledging who this is, prophet, him, Jesus Christ. They're starting to see it. There are some people who are starting to see it. Remember the Samaritans, they came out and they believed on him. There are people believing on Jesus during this time. And that's the whole point of Jesus doing all of these signs and miracles and whatnot. But then we move on to verse 15. And it says, therefore, when Jesus perceived that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he departed again to the mountain by himself alone. Okay. And this is fascinating to me because there Jesus is doing all of these things out in the open. Everybody's paying attention to him. They want to, you can just imagine, like everybody just is trying to get like weasel their way closer and closer to Jesus, try to get closer to him through the crowd, you know? And that's what's going on. And so in verse 15, you get the idea that these guys are going to take him by force to make him a king. And so if you guys, I'm New King James, Neo, King James, New King James. But in the book of Revelation, this is what's really interesting. So if you guys understand the rapture, right? Like the word rapture is not in our English translation. You can't find it. There's no rapture. The word rapture is not in our Bible. The word Trinity is not in our Bible. But the Greek word harpazo is in our Bible. You have harpazo multiple different times, but the Greek word harpazo in the Latin translation is raptoro. And the word raptoro in the English translation is rapture. So the word rapture is there. You just have to back your way up and see it in a different language, because remember, the Bible wasn't written in English. So that's what's important to understand. Anyways, I say all that because in verse 15, John chapter 6, verse 15, it says they were about to come and take him by force. This word here, if you click on this in your little app, is harpazo. I find that very fascinating. This is harpazo, take him by force, to seize violently. And I want you just to imagine this kind of concept, because they wanted to take him by force to make him king, right? So to make him king. Now, mind you, there was already a king in the area. Can you imagine if you're the king and now all of a sudden another king arises? It would be a massive revolution type situation, right? Like that's a big deal. If you're sitting on the throne at that time and if somebody pops up and you're like, hey, this guy's a king, it's going to be all out war, right? Anyways, just understand that there's all kinds of dynamics there. But it says that this was basically not his time, because in verse 16 it continues on to say, now when evening came, his disciples went down to the sea. But he gets away. It says he departed again to the mountain by himself alone. And so it's interesting. They see everything that he's doing and they want to make him king, but he leaves. And so this is why it's important. And this is so neat, guys. I mean, this is why it is so important, because if you guys were here, can you put your hand up if you were here for our study of Daniel 9? If you were here for our study of Daniel 9, especially Daniel 9, 24, 25, 26, and 27, you have, yes. Okay, this is why this is so cool, because understand here that this is part, like everything all the way up until the point. Remember, let's go back to Daniel 9. In Daniel 9, Daniel 9, 24 through 27, amazing prophecy. Thanks, God. There is an amazing prophecy that is given in Daniel 9. Now, here we are. Remember where you are in the timeline, right? Like, you remember the statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had in his dream. There was a head. The head of gold was Babylon, then the Medes and the Persians, then the Greece Empire, and then the Roman Empire, right? So the Roman Empire, that's where we are in the timeline, okay? So we're getting down in the timeline, and also remember where we are, because in Daniel 9, 24, and 25 is given a very distinct gap of 483 years that need to basically take place. And here we are. We're winding down to the time to where Jesus is going to ride into town on a donkey. We're not there yet. But that's what's crazy about this verse, because in verse 15, they wanted to take him as king. Remember, they wanted to take him as king, but it was not his time. And that's interesting. Jesus understands that it's not his time. He's like, you know what? Not my time. My time's coming soon. I'm going to ride in on town on a donkey. That's going to be when I fulfill the prophecy. If he allowed them to take him as king right now, he would not have fulfilled the prophecy. So I find that very, very fascinating. So keep that in mind. Like, try to remember where you guys are all in the prophetic timeline from Daniel 9:24, the Roman Empire. Remember all of the things that happened leading up to this, because this is one massive story. It's a massive crescendo leading to all of these things. Thanks, Becca. I appreciate that. So it is very neat to pay attention to that kind of stuff. Anyways, we'll move on in verse 16. So thanks. So he departed again to the mountain by himself alone. And now we get to verse 16. It says, now when evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into the boat, and went over the sea toward Capernaum. And it was already dark, and Jesus had not come to them. Then verse 18, then it says, the sea arose because a great wind was blowing. All right, so I'll read verse 19. In verse 19, it says, so when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea, drawing near the boat, and they were afraid. But he said to them, it is I, do not be afraid. Then they willingly received him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at land where they were going. Now, there's a lot of things I want to talk about here, because this is very interesting. Okay, so let's rewind here and unpack it. So they're trying to take Jesus forcibly, like force him to be king. He departed and he went to the mountain alone. So he's up high. And then it says that evening came and his disciples went to the sea. So Jesus is up high and they went to the sea. And we know that that they were told, basically, if you go to the other Gospels, you can see that Jesus told them to do it. So let's go there real fast. Let's go to Matthew 14, just so we can see. In Matthew 14, in Matthew 14, verse 22, it says this. In Matthew 14, verse 22, it says, immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, while he sent the multitudes away. So now you get a little bit more context, right? Remember, these people, Matthew's writing about it at the same time, but Jesus tells his disciples to get into the boat, but you don't get that from the Gospel of John, because it says, now when evening came, John chapter 6, verse 16, it says, now when evening came, his disciples went down to the sea. But you don't get that other context. You have to go to Matthew to get it. So that's why this is one of those times where John almost assumes that you understand Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because he's assuming you read those already. So pay attention to that. But it says, they got into the boat and went over to the sea toward Capernaum. So this is the Sea of Galilee right here. And so where it says sea, it's almost misguiding you in a sense, because when you picture, like if you were to go over there, like if you can go on YouTube and look up the sea, but it's almost underwhelming in a sense, because when you imagine a sea, you probably picture something that you can't see the other side of, right? Like it's just like so far over there you can't, but it's not that way. This sea it's almost just like a big lake. Like it's not that big of a deal. But this is why it's interesting, because when it's about 7 miles long, or 7 miles wide, and it says in verse 18, we'll just read verse 17 again. They got into the boat and went over the sea toward Capernaum, and it was already dark, and Jesus had not come to them. Then the sea arose because a great wind was blowing. So there's this storm situation going on. And then if you go back to the other Gospels, that you can see Jesus pretty much had sight of these guys. They never left their sight, and it's such a neat thing. Like he's always paying attention. Like these are his boys, and he's watching them. And like so, they're getting crazy fatigued. You can read about that in Mark 6, verse 48, if you're interested. But Jesus could see them, and they were fatigued because they're trying to get through this stormy sea or lake. And so what I want you to just think about is these guys, they're fishermen by nature. Like this is what they do. They are professionals at what they do. Like this sea, this lake, it's not that big, and it doesn't really make sense. So basically, so you have these mountains up here, and then down here is where the sea actually is. So the mountains kind of could create like some kind of a vortex with wind and whatnot. But it's really interesting because you remember the sea where they were all, when they were in the storm, where they were afraid for their lives? Like they were thinking they were going to die. That storm where they were all thinking that they were about to perish and they woke Jesus up, like that doesn't make sense because that doesn't happen at this kind of place. And so that's why a lot of people theorize that was almost a demonic kind of situation, storm, because if you go there and you see the situation and you understand that they were professional fishermen, they don't get, like, they're not worried about that kind of stuff. Like, and so anyways, it's just, there's a whole bunch of like, there are things that are happening that you don't think of and that I don't think of because we weren't there. So it's important to like kind of zoom out and kind of just look at the entire situation, see who you're dealing with, what was their profession, and then see like the lay of the land. There's a whole bunch of stuff that doesn't make sense. But if you just read it, you'll just skim right over it and not even think about it. But anyways, so there's a stormy sea, and it's about 7 miles. This Sea of Galilee is about 7 miles wide. And so in verse 19, where it says, John chapter 6, verse 19, it says, so when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, so they're about halfway through, because if it's about 7 miles long, it says they rowed about 3 or 4 miles. That's about halfway. It says they saw Jesus walking on the sea and drawing near the boat, and they were afraid. And that's just mind-blowing to me. You can just put yourself in their shoes and just be like, what am I looking at right now? Jesus obviously knows how this appears. This is something that just speaks to them individually, and just leaves other people questioning, kind of scratching their heads as we get along in the chapter. But these disciples were privy to things that you and I, like this was a testimony to these guys, right? Like he's doing this for them. Remember the water into the wine? That was for the disciples that were present. Like that was for them to see. Like he was building up, he was bringing them along, he was meeting them where they were at, and he was building them up. It's a neat thing. But now he does this thing and he shows them what he can do. And in verse 20 he says, but he said to them, it is I, do not be afraid. And then in verse 21, this verse cracks me up. It says, then they willingly received him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land where they were going. So I don't know, this verse just cracks me up. It says immediately. Now, mind you, just in in chapter 6, verse 19, it says, so when they rowed about 3 or 4 miles, meaning they had about 3 or 4 miles left to go. Right when he got on the boat, it says, then they willingly received him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land where they were going. That is, yeah, I mean, it's crazy. I'm telling you what, like, was it just like in a blink of an eye, boof, like, were all their hair just like blown back, like, like what happened? I blinked. Did I miss it? When did we get ice cream? But that is crazy to think about, this kind of stuff. Visualize it. It's, I can't. Anyways, okay, so they show up, and now we're starting to see some of the questions start to form from the people that were on the other side. So in verse 22, we'll move on. It says, on the following day, when the people who were standing on the other side of the sea saw that there was no other boat there except that one which his disciples had entered, and that Jesus had not entered the boat with his disciples, but his disciples had gone away alone. So these guys are puzzled. In verse 23, however, other boats came from Tiberias, near the place where they ate bread after the Lord had given thanks. It's also, it's emphasizing on the Lord giving thanks. Like, why are we bringing this up again? I don't know. But John thought it notable to mention that twice that the Lord gave thanks for the bread. Pray for your food. Pray over your food. Pray while you're doing this. Raise your children up that kind of way so they can see it. Do it when you're out at restaurants and stuff. Just do it. Bow your head. It'll be a testimony for people when they look at you. And then maybe you can tell them about Jesus. But in verse 24, it says, when the people therefore saw that Jesus was not there, nor his disciples, they also got into boats and came to Capernaum, seeking Jesus. And when they found him on the other side of the sea, they said to him, Rabbi, when did you come here? You see, these guys are puzzled. They have no idea what's going on. Jesus just walked that way, hopped in a boat, and then poof, like just was on the other side. It's crazy. Rabbi, when did you come here? Verse 26, Jesus answered them and said, most assuredly, I say to you, you seek me, not because you saw the signs, but because you ate of the loaves and were filled. Interesting. How applicable is this in our world today? There are people who are seeking Jesus not because they believe, but because of some other reason. And here you have it. Jesus calls them out. This is a superficial enthusiasm, in a sense. He says, you didn't seek me because you saw the signs, but because your bellies were full, in a sense. Superficial enthusiasm. In verse 27, it says, do not labor for the food which perishes, but for the food which endures to everlasting life, which the Son of Man will give you, because God the Father has set his seal on him. And it's interesting because if you click on that word seal in your blue letter Bible, one of the definitions that pop up will be for security from Satan. For security from Satan. And that's interesting. So going back to what we talked about in John chapter 6, verse 12, I'm going to read John chapter 6, verse 12 again. It says, so when they were filled, he said to his disciples, gather up the fragments that remain so that nothing is lost. Now we're setting the scene a little bit, right? So we're working up to it. We're gonna complete the picture here in a little bit, but now we're introduced to this seal where in verse 27, at the end of verse 27, he says, because God the Father has set his seal on him, right? So this is seal on him, like on Jesus. God the Father set his seal on him. But in verse 28, you're introduced to this seal. In verse 28, then they said to him, what shall we do that we may work the works of God? And Jesus answered and said to them, this is the work of God, that you believe in him whom he sent. Now the word in is on, in or on, it's synonymous in a sense, but it means into or rely. So this believe in, believe into, believe, rely in him whom he sent. So you're introduced to in John chapter 6, verse 12, where it says nothing is lost. You're introduced to the seal that is brought into play. But now we're going to work our way down to verse 36 here, and we'll talk about that. But in John chapter 6, verse 30, it says, therefore they said to him, what sign will you perform then, that we may see it and believe you? What work will you do? Verse 31, it says, our fathers ate the manna in the desert. As it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat. Then Jesus said to them, most assuredly I say to you, Moses did not give you the bread from heaven, but my Father gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. Then they said to him, Lord, give us this bread always. And Jesus said to them, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall never hunger, and he who believes in me shall never thirst. But I said to you that you have seen me and yet do not believe. So I'm going to stop there for a second because let's talk about what we just read. So first off in verse 30, they say, what sign will you perform? These guys are always seeking a sign. Show us something. Prove it, right? Do something for us so that we can. Now, mind you, these guys have heard and have already kind of seen in a sense because they're showing up because their bellies were full. Now, they might not have actually seen the miracle themselves because, like, there was arguably 15,000 people, right? Like it says 5,000 men, but let's just say that there is minimum of 10,000 people out there, right? There's probably 10,000 people out there. So there's 10,000 people. They can't all see what's going on, right? But they had their bellies full. And so now they show up and they say, show us something. Prove it to me. Because now mind you, these guys, like the things of Jesus is spreading. People know who Jesus is, but now they're like, hey, you prove it to me. Like, I heard about it, but you prove it to me. It's interesting because when you go to the Samaritan, go back to the woman at the well just had a conversation. There was nothing else. It was just a conversation. She runs into town. She tells everybody, and everybody believed, right? And they believed because of her testimony. And that is crazy to think about. Now, on the flip side of that coin, now we have these people who show up And they start almost interrogating him, like, where'd you come from? How'd you get here? We were on the other side. What's going on? And then they're like, why don't you show us a sign? Everybody is always looking for a sign. But then Jesus answers and says, in verse 31, it says, our fathers ate the manna, or I'm sorry, these people are answering or are talking here in verse 31. And it says, our fathers ate the manna in the desert, as it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat. So manna, just so you know, means what is it? Like, that's literally like, what is it? Manna. What is it? I don't know why it's doing that, but manna means what is it? So manna is now brought into play. And then Jesus answers in verse 32. He says, then Jesus said to them, most assuredly I say to you, Moses did not give you the bread, but my Father did. That's basically what he tells them. So they bring Moses, they bring manna in here, and Jesus basically redirects them because they're seeing it wrong. And so now manna, but then we go down. So let's go on down to verse 35. In verse 35, so you have manna brought into play, but now we get to verse 35, and it says, and Jesus said to them, I am the bread of life. Okay, so now you have manna, and you have the bread of life. So if you could do a little bit of comparing manna to the bread, Jesus says, I am the bread of life. Manna was temporary, right? It was there. They collected it. They could only take enough for one day, except for twice on the sixth day. But it was temporary. It was there, and now it's not, right? Like, it's gone. Like, you can make an argument, like, some of it is left in the ark, but it's gone. There's no more manna. There's no more manna. So it was temporary. Jesus, it's not going anywhere. It's permanent. Manna was given only to Israel back in the Old Testament. Jesus is given to everybody. Everybody. That's pretty neat. Manna sustained them physically, but Jesus sustains you spiritually. He's trying to get them to see. He's trying to walk them down and just show them. Like, it's amazing how you can guide somebody to a picture and point at something and say, hey, do you see that? And they might not be able to see it because they're not standing in the right spot. So you kind of need to move them over a little bit and say, oh, now I see it. I couldn't see it over there, right? These guys, they're not getting it. And so Jesus is just trying to walk them that way. But it's interesting. So the manna basically sustained these guys physically, and here coming up, Jesus is going to talk about how they're no longer they're dead, and so it's the connection is coming back. That manna was for them physically, but Jesus is the bread of life. He is there spiritually, and he's not going anywhere. He is permanent. Like, this whole situation, the compare and contrast of manna and the bread of life, it's a good thing to focus on, because they are both brought into play at the same time. And it's funny because the guys here were the ones who brought manna into play, and then Jesus just uses that, and he's like, you know what, you're bringing manna into play, but I'm the bread of life. You need to look at me. Like, I'm it. I'm that guy that the Bible is talking about. So then we get on to verse 37. In verse 37 it says, all that the Father gives me will come to me, and the one who comes to me I will by no means cast out. Now, this is very interesting, because this gives you, like, this is one of those verses that you can just try to just think on for a while and unpack and try to understand, because it's one of those what's going on here situation. But in verse 37 it says, all that the Father gives me will come to me. Okay, all that the Father gives me will come to me, right? So this is interesting, because there are people out there, Calvinists, who believe in predestination, right? There are people out there who think that, hey, I'm a Christian, so I don't have to worry about anything anymore. I don't have to tell people about Jesus, because if you're going to get saved, you're going to get saved, right? Like, what's the point? Like, you're going to do it anyways. It's going to happen. That's an incorrect way of thinking. You can go back to 1 Peter Also, why is Satan constantly going before the Lord, constantly accusing the brethren? Right? Like, why would he be doing that if there wasn't a chance, like there's a chance that you might... Anyways, you get my gist. But here in verse 37, it says, all that the Father gives me will come to me. He knows the beginning from the end, and that's very interesting. They will come to him. And it's not him saying I'm controlling people, but he knows how it is. Like, he is God, omniscient. He knows all things. And it's very, very interesting. It's interesting because it says all that the Father gives me will come to me, meaning he knew I was coming to him. He knew before he loved you before, right? Like the story of Ruth and Boaz. Boaz just shows up and he's looking into his fields and he looks across the way and he sees Ruth before Ruth even knew he existed. The picture, Boaz is Jesus, Ruth is the church. He loved us first. The entire picture here is so neat, but in verse 37, all that the Father gives me will come to me. I mean, but then it goes on. Oh, let's finish that verse. In verse 37, and the one who comes to me, I will by no means cast out. So let's talk about that because this is an interesting thing, right? Cast out. So the question is, if I deny Christ and I say, no, I don't know him. He's not, like, I've never heard of the guy, like, and I just start going down that path, do I lose my salvation? It's interesting, right? Because my question is, so Peter denied Jesus with an oath. Like, an oath is a big deal, right? Like, that's no small thing. But Peter denied Jesus with an oath, and he was not cast out. It's an interesting connection there, right? And the whole situation at the end of John is pretty neat. But anyways, let's move on because it says in verse 38, it says, for I have come down from heaven not to do my own will, but the will of him who sent me. This is the will of the Father who sent me, that of all he has given me, I should lose nothing, but should raise it up at the last day. He's not going to lose you. And that is so neat. Like, this is like a good security verse. I think it's important to have. He's not going to lose you. He knows. In verse 37, it says, all that the Father gives me will come to me. He knows. And then he says in verse 39, he says, I should lose nothing. That's neat. I find that very neat. But here we go. In verse 39, verse 40, and verse 44, we are going to get 3 references to future resurrections. So in verse 39, at the end of verse 39, I'm going to read it again. It says, this is the will of the Father who sent me, that of all he has given me, I should lose nothing, but should raise it up at the last day. So there's your first the first reference of the resurrection. And now we're going to get to another one in verse 40. And it says this, and this is the will of him who sent me, that everyone who sees the Son and believes in him may have everlasting life. And I will raise him up at the last day. So the word sees there is talking about spiritually in the faith kind of seeing. Like, not like obviously you and I do not see Jesus. It's a spiritual kind of context there. But it says, sees the Son and believes. So you're getting the belief situation again all throughout this. But baptism is like nowhere to be found. And so this is why it's important. We talked about before in 1 Corinthians how Paul was talking about, he's like, I'm glad I didn't baptize any of you guys, because then he would have said, I'm baptized by Paul. It is not about baptism. It is all about Jesus. And that is what the whole context is. There are people out there who say you need to get baptized in order to be saved. That's incorrect. That's where I'm standing. I'm going to die on that hill. And there are people who will die on the hill that you need to be baptized. That's not me. I'm not going to do that. It is all about Jesus Christ and what he did. Because if you can obtain righteousness through the law, then Jesus died in vain. If you could, Ephesians 2:8-9, right? For by grace are you saved through faith, and that not of yourselves. It is the gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast. Baptism would be classified under that work umbrella. It's important to understand that. So there's that resurrection being brought into play. But then we get to verse 41, and it says, the Jews then complained about him because he said, I am the bread which came down from heaven. Here we go. Now we're being brought into the Jews. Now, when you see the Jews here, like that's referring to the leadership, which could be probably like 10 to 15 dudes, right? So that's what's going on here. The Jews, in verse 41, the Jews then complained about him because he said, I am the bread which came down from heaven. And they said, is this not Jesus, the son of Joseph, whose father and mother we know? How is it then, he says, I have come down from heaven? Jesus therefore answered and said to them, do not murmur among yourselves. Calls them out right on the spot. No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him. And I will raise him up at the last day. So there's your other reference to the resurrection. But it's interesting. No, in verse 44, no one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him. Guys, there are things happening in our world that we have no knowledge of. And that's why I'm talking about, let's go back to where we can kind of visualize it in John 1, verse 12, 13, and 14, where it says he gave them the right to become children of God. If you are going to become a child of God, and that means that you become a new creation, that means that inside here, something happens. You don't see it. I don't see it, but there is something spiritual that happens. And we need to understand that we can't wrap our minds around the massive amounts of power that's going on here. But using that example right there and going back to verse 44, John 6:44, it says, no one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him. This, God the Father is doing something, right? Like there's stuff happening. It's hard to wrap your mind around. But you're getting the idea in John 6:37 where it says, all that the Father gives me will come to me, right? And then you couple that with verse 44 where it says, unless the Father who sent me draws him, right? So the Father is drawing people, right? This Father, he's doing something, and nobody's coming to Jesus unless the Father draws him. And it's like, what is going on around me? Like, we don't even understand anything in the world. Like, we as humans like to think that we kind of know some things, or if I have a PhD or a doctorate, MD, whatever, like we might think, oh, like, look at me, I'm smart. No, some of the dumbest people have PhDs, I'm telling you what. But it is interesting that we kind of think that we look at ourselves like we're kind of knowledgeable, right? Yeah. No, we don't know anything. This kind of stuff is so much higher than your imagination. And it's crazy. This world, I'm telling you, it's interesting. Anyways, but in verse 45, it says, it is written in the prophets, and they shall all be taught by God. Therefore, everyone who has heard and learned from the Father comes to me. Not that anyone has seen the Father, except he who is from God. He has seen the Father. Jesus is saying, nobody's seen him, but I have. That's what he's saying in verse 46. But in verse 47, it says, most assuredly I say to you, he who believes in me has everlasting life. The word has there is present tense. You have already. It's important to understand that. That is such a neat concept. You have it. He who believes in me has everlasting life. You have it already. But then you get to verse 48. Here's one of those I ams that you're going to find. One of the 7. It says, I am the bread of life. This is one of those things. Let me see something real fast. I am the bread of life. Okay, so in verse 49, here we go back to the manna. It says, your fathers ate the manna in the wilderness and are dead. Interesting. Go back to verse 31. John chapter 6, verse 31. These guys who are talking to Jesus, they say, our fathers ate the manna in the desert. So they're bringing their forefathers up, right? Like, hey, our fathers did these things. And then Jesus answers in verse 49. He says, your fathers ate the manna in the wilderness and are dead. So that's obviously a difference between the manna and I am the bread of life, right? Like, they're not seeing the picture. Jesus is trying to walk them to it. Verse 50, it says, this is the bread which comes down from heaven, that one may eat of it and not die. So if I tell you, if I walk up to somebody, imagine if I walk up to somebody and say like, hey, I'm never going to die. And that's how I introduce myself. Hey, I'm Ryan. I'm never going to die. Like, you would look at me and you'd be like, you belong in a home. Because they don't understand. Like, you have to have a certain level of understanding here, right? And so they're not seeing it. But Jesus says, this is the bread which comes down from heaven, meaning himself, that one may eat of it and not die. What's he talking about? Well, how do you get to everlasting life? This is all encapsulated in these couple chapters. John 3:16. Now we're getting the bread of life. Now you're seeing all these things. It's all coming together. But in verse 51, he says, again, I am the living bread which came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. And the bread that I shall give is my flesh, which I shall give for the life of the world. Okay, the whole picture here, I'm gonna bring it back. Okay, it says in verse 51, which I shall give for the life of the world. Remember that scroll in Revelation chapter 5? God the Father is sitting on the throne. In his hand is a scroll. That scroll is a title deed to the earth that we are currently on. That scroll originally was given to Adam. Adam had it. He forfeited it when he sinned. The title deed to the earth went away. And so Jesus had to come, pay that price, redeem it. We had to be redeemed. And now when John has that vision in the book of Revelation chapter 5, John is weeping and sobbing convulsively because there was nobody who could take the scroll from the Father's hand. And then one of the 24 elders, the church, you and I, taps John on the shoulder and says, hey, don't worry, the Lion of the tribe of Judah is worthy. And so Jesus shows up and he goes and he takes that scroll. He paid for it. And here in John chapter 6, verse 51, it says, which I shall give for the life of the world. He laid his life down. That is how he bought it. God the Father required a sacrifice in order for that title deed, everything needed to be paid in full, right? When he died on the cross, it is finished, is what happened. It was done right then and there. Boom, done. It's really neat. But you're getting this weird concept. Like they're having this conversation, right? Jesus and these guys are having this conversation. He's like, my flesh, my blood, you got to eat he's using weird words to these people that they've never heard before. And so you can imagine that they're all showing up. They all want to talk to this guy named Jesus because they've all heard about him. They're all wondering. They're like, what's going on? What's he all about? And then he starts talking in these riddles, in a sense. Jesus uses metaphors. He uses parables. He uses words that they wouldn't understand, but somebody else would. And so that's what's kind of neat. So these guys might not ever get it, but here we go on, and we're going to get to this really neat situation here. And this is wild. But in verse 53, it says, then Jesus said to them, most assuredly I say to you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Oh, that's weird. But in verse 54, whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise him up at the last day. What in the world is going on here? But let's go, before we venture off here, go to, where is it? Go to 2 Timothy. Go to 2 Timothy 3:16. 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 16. Okay. So this is easy to remember because, and this is a good one. You guys should write this down because this is good. But 2 Timothy 3:16 is easy to remember because of John 3:16, right? 2 Timothy 3:16. But 2 Timothy 3:16, it says this, all scripture is given by inspiration of God, and it is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness, that the man of God may be complete, thoroughly equipped for every good work. Okay, so we're just going to focus in on 2 Timothy 3:16. So there are 4 different things here that are mentioned in verse 16. It says profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, and for instruction in righteousness. Okay, so you have those 4 things. You have doctrine, reproof, for correction, and for instruction in righteousness. So doctrine here, when it says doctrine, that is what is right. When you have reproof, that is what is not right. When you have correction, that is how to get it right. And then you have What's the last one? Instruction, and that is how to stay right. So that's what's going on here. This verse is good to know because it tells you what's right, what's not right, how to get it right, and it tells you how to stay right. So what's right, what's not right, how to get it right, and how to stay right. That's what the scripture is all for, okay? So keep that in mind, because now this is where this is interesting. So let's go to Proverbs chapter 30. Go to Proverbs chapter 30. And this right here, this is wild. Okay, in Proverbs chapter 30, verse 1, that's where, so hold your place in Proverbs 30, verse 1, and let's go back to John and remember what we just read, okay? In John chapter 6, verse 54, it says, "Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise him up at the last day," right? Okay, so eats my flesh, drinks my blood, okay? Proverbs 30, verse 1. So now we are at Proverbs 30, verse 1, and this is weird. This is a weird verse. It says, "The words of Agur, the son of Jakeh, his utterance, this man declared to Ethiel and Ukal." Weird names. But this is what is so interesting about the Bible, because if you know about the Bible, he even talks about how there are riddles, right? He talks in kind of... I think in Proverbs, it talks about, maybe it's in Proverbs 1. I think it uses the word dark sayings. Hold on. So hold your place in Proverbs 30 and then go to Proverbs 1, verse 6. And this is interesting. In Proverbs 1, verse 6, just so you can understand how the scripture is written, there are hidden things here in the Bible that people will find that other people might not ever see. But in Proverbs 1, verse 6, it says, "To understand a proverb and an enigma, the words of the wise and their riddles." That is an interesting situation. At least that's how the New King James says it. But in the King James, it says, instead of riddles, it says dark sayings, right? Like there's riddles, there's enigmas, there's things going on in the Bible that are fascinating to discover. And if you don't know about the genealogy, from Noah to, I can't remember, but it basically tells the gospel just in the form of the meaning of everybody's name from 10 generations. It's really, or 7 generations, I can't remember, but it's really neat. Anyways, go back to Proverbs 30, verse 1. And so what, if you were going to translate Proverbs 30, verse 1 over into something else and actually say it in if you were to take the names like of Agur, Jakeh, Ithiel, and Ukal, if you were to translate all of those names down and write them down, and you were to take all like his utterance and you were to translate that down, what it would come up with is this right here. It would literally say, if in the Hebrew, if you were to do this in the Hebrew, because remember the Old Testament Hebrew, it would say this. For 30 verse 1, it would literally say this: "The words gathered of the wise son, of the pious father, the prophecy of the mighty oracle, that El," or God, E-L, God, "that El arrives to be consumed." And that's interesting. Okay, I'm going to read it again. It says, "The words gathered of the wise son, of the pious father, the prophecy of the mighty oracle, that God arrives to be consumed." Interesting. I'm going to read it one more time. "The words gathered of the wise son, of the pious father, the prophecy of the mighty oracle, that El," or God, "arrives to be consumed." And so that's what, that's in Proverbs 30, verse 1. If you were to translate it directly from the Hebrew, if you were to take the names of Agur, the Jakeh, or Ithiel, and Ukal, and you were to plug and play kind of situation, that is what it would actually say. And so that's what's really neat about it, because it says the last part of that verse would mean that God arrives to be consumed. That's in the book of Proverbs. that it's saying that God arrives to be consumed, but you don't see it in the English translation. That verse is completely messed up in a sense. But so keep that in mind, right? So it's interesting. So that God arrives to be consumed. What does that mean? Now that's back in the Old Testament. Solomon primarily wrote the book of Proverbs. David primarily wrote the book of Psalms. So this is back during their age, their day, and they're saying that God arrives to be consumed. What does that even mean? Well, now let's go back to John 6, verse 54, and look at it again. It says, whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise him up at the last day. God arrived to be consumed. And I'm just, what in the world is that? Like, that is so mind-blowing to me. I'm just taken back every time. It just is so stinking neat. Proverbs, there it is, talking about it. But he arrived to be consumed, and it's interesting. So let's go on. Let's go back to Proverbs verse 30, and let's talk about verse 4 now. Proverbs 30, verse 4, it says, who has ascended into heaven or descended? Who has gathered the wind in his fists? Who has bound the waters in a garment? Who has established all the ends of the earth? What is his name? And what is his son's name, if you know? Okay, so let's start with the first one. Proverbs 30, verse 4. It says, who has ascended into heaven or descended? So go to Hosea 5:15. Was it Hosea 5:15? In Hosea 5:15, it says this, I will return again to my place till they acknowledge their offense. Then they will seek my face in their affliction. They will earnestly seek me. So it says, I will return again. Now this is in the Old Testament. This is in the Old Testament. It says, I will return again. In the Old Testament. If it says, I will return again, then that means he had to have left. Now that's interesting. Jesus came and he left. Now he's saying, I will return again. Jesus' second coming will not happen until Israel repents and ask him to return, which is talked about in Daniel 12. But that's what's talking about in Proverbs 30 verse, the first part of Proverbs 30, verse 4. Who has ascended into heaven or descended, right? Hosea 5:15, that covers that. So now let's move down the list in verse 4. It says, who has gathered the wind in his fists? So let's go to Psalms 135. Psalms 135, verse 7. In Psalms 135, verse 7, it says, he causes the vapors to ascend from the ends of the earth. He makes lightning for the rain. He brings the wind out of his treasuries. So that answers the question, who has gathered the wind in his fists? So now let's go to Psalm 104, verse 6. Psalm 104, verse 6. Psalm 104, verse 6. And hold your place there, because the question in Proverbs 30, verse 4, it says, who has bound the waters in a garment? Psalms 104, verse 6 says, you covered it with the deep as with a garment. The water stood above the mountains. I mean, we're answering all these questions here. And then it says, goes on to say, who has established all the ends of the earth? So go on to Psalm 72, verse 8. Psalm 72, verse 8. Psalm 72, verse 8. And the question we are answering here is, who has established all the ends of the earth? It says in Psalm 72, verse 8, it says, he shall have dominion also from sea to sea, and from the river to the ends of the earth. who has established all the ends of the earth. It says, what is his name and what is his son's name, if you know? Go to Psalm 110, verse 1. Go to Psalm 110, verse 1. In Psalm 110, or the question is, what is his name and what is his son's name, if you know? Psalm 110, verse 1, it says this, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool. The Lord, okay, I'm going to stop there for a second. So the question in Proverbs 30 is, what is his name and what is his son's name, if you know? So in Psalm 110, verse 1, it says, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool. Now, this is interesting. Now, keep in mind, this is David who is talking here in Psalm 110, verse 1. In Psalm 110, verse 1, this is David, and he is saying, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool. Now, hold your place in Psalm 110, and let's go to Matthew. Let's go to Matthew 22 real fast. Matthew 22. Matthew 22, verse 41. So in Matthew 22, verse 41, it says this. Matthew 22, verse 41. And continuing, it says this in Matthew 22, verse 41. It says, while the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them, saying, what do you think about the Christ? Whose son is he? They said to him, the son of David. He said to them, how then does David in the Spirit call him Lord, saying, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool. So the question here is that, now we read Psalm 110, we already read it, right? So now in Matthew, you see that Jesus quotes that psalm because he says in verse 44, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool. So the question here is that, the scene is that Jesus is having a conversation with the Pharisees, and he's questioning them because they already admitted, he basically walked them into a corner. They already admitted that the Christ is going to be the son of David. So the question is that Jesus asked them in verse 43, Matthew 22, verse 43, Jesus says, okay, how then does David in the Spirit call him Lord? So the question that they couldn't wrap their minds around is, how is he saying, why is King David calling him Lord if he is his son, right? Because it doesn't make any sense. The son is not greater than the father, right? So David wouldn't call his son Lord. So they're having this hard time wrapping their minds around it. They couldn't understand it. But that's because they didn't understand the situation of who Jesus was, the lineage, right? Like, he is technically a son of David, but it says, it moves on in Matthew 22, verse 45. It says, if David then calls him Lord, how is he his son, right? There's the question. These Pharisees don't understand. They don't know how to answer the question. And the last verse in Matthew 22, verse 46 is very funny, because he basically shuts them up. It says, and no one was able to answer him a word, nor from that day on did anyone dare question him anymore. I just find that so funny. He walked them into a corner. He asked them a question. They couldn't answer it. And it all goes back. Jesus is of the tribe of Judah. He's of the son of David. He is the son of David. How can Jesus be the Messiah if he's the son of David? Why would David be calling Jesus Lord? Like they couldn't really see the whole picture. And it was meant to confuse them. They couldn't figure it out. But you and I have the ability to see it from all the way over here, and now we can see what's going on from a stance that they were not able to. It's the same concept on why the Jewish people, like in our world today, in 2023, if you were to go over to Israel and you were to ask a Jewish person, hey, what do you think about Isaiah 53? They would say, I've never read it before, because to them that is a forbidden chapter. Isaiah 53 is littered with everything about Jesus Christ. And so that is why the Jewish people, they can't explain that away. And so they just tell people, That's forbidden. We're not going to read that chapter. Let's talk about something else. So they go from chapter 52 to 54. They just skip right on over it. But if you go up to the Jewish people, they'll read all that kind of stuff. If you have them read Isaiah 53 and you ask them who that sounds like, you're going to walk them to it, and they just missed it. They can't see it, and the reason why they can't see it is because when Jesus showed up on a donkey, it said they missed the time of their visitation, and Jesus told them that since you missed the time of your visitation, you will be blind in part. So the Jewish people today are still blind in part to who Jesus is. It's all connecting back and forth all over the place, no matter how you look at it. It's absolutely amazing. But let's go back to John, because we just kind of went off on a little rabbit trail there. But in John chapter 6, verse 54, it says, "Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise him up at the last day." So hopefully, with going back to Proverbs 30, verse 1, if you guys go and dissect all that as much as you want to, you guys can find it for yourself. You'll see what it says. But it says that God will arrive to be consumed. And that's all the way back in the book of Proverbs. And it's fascinating because now you're reading it here in John. Now it makes a lot more sense what's going on. It's like, what is he talking about? He expects the Jewish people, he held them accountable to know the Old Testament, right? And so they review the Old Testament and they see it completely differently than you and I do, right? Because they're of their culture, of how they were brought up. And it's interesting because in our world today, the Jewish people still do certain, they do the 7 feasts of the Lord, right? They do all of these things still, and they're mimicking everything that Jesus did and will do in the future, and they just don't see it. But when you and I watch it, we're just like, are you kidding me right now? Like, do you not see what you're doing? Like, they don't see it. And it's amazing. They'll see it one day until the fullness of Gentiles. But anyways, moving on, John chapter 6, verse 55, it says, "For my flesh is food indeed, and my blood is drink indeed. He who eats my flesh and drinks my blood abides in me, and I in him." So this is talking about constant communion with him, right? And so in verse 57, it continues and it says, "As the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father, so he who feeds on me will live because of me. This is the bread which came down from heaven, not as your fathers ate the manna and are dead. He who eats this bread will live forever." So again, we go all the way back and we talk about how manna compared to the bread, because they're the ones who brought manna into the conversation. Jesus just used it. He's like, you're talking about manna. You're bringing up your fathers. He's like, I'm here to do something completely different. It is a completely different time. Everything changed when Jesus entered the game. And Jesus enters the chat, right? Like, and everybody's like, they can't see it, so he's trying to walk them into it. But back during their time, they had no idea what they were getting into. And so he's trying to tell them, but they couldn't see. You and I can see. And so it is, it's really, really quite neat. But in verse 59, it says, "These things he said in the synagogue as he taught in Capernaum." So then we get to verse 60. And verse 60 through 66 is basically where you're going to see the majority of people be unbelieving. These are where the majority of everybody who's around, it's going to be a majority of unbelieving people. And then in 67 through 69, you're going to see the believing minority. And then 70 and 71, you're going to see these the professing apostate. But here in verse 60, we'll just read it. It says, "Therefore, many of his disciples, when they heard this, said, 'This is a hard saying. Who can understand it?'" Right? Can you imagine being back then? Who can understand it? Verse 61, "When Jesus knew in himself that his disciples complained about this, he said to them, 'Does this offend you? What then if you should see the Son of Man ascend where he was before? It is the Spirit who gives life. The flesh profits nothing. The words that I speak to you are spirit, and they are life. But there are some of you who do not believe." For Jesus knew from the beginning who they were who did not believe and who would betray him. And he said, "Therefore I have said to you that no one can come to me unless it has been granted to him by my Father. It brings back what we talked about in John chapter 6, verse 37. And in verse 37, it says, all that the Father gives me will come to me. And then you go back to verse 44, and it says, no one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him. And now you see in verse 65, and it says, and he said, therefore I have said to you that no one can come to me unless it has been granted to him by my Father. It's an interesting, things are happening that we cannot fully wrap our minds around. From that time, many of his disciples went back and walked with him no more. Now, these disciples are just the riffraff, right? Like, they gone. These were the crowd. But there goes the unbelieving majority. And now we're going to get into the believing minority, which is very easy to understand because, the Bible talks about how broad is the way that leads to destruction, and narrow is the gate that leads to life, and few there are that find it. So here we are in verse 67. This is the minority. Then Jesus said to the 12, do you also want to go away? And here we go. Simon Peter really steps up here. He says, but Simon Peter answered him, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. Can you imagine? Just remember everything that they've experienced up to this point. Nothing like they've ever seen. Everything about Jesus, who he was, his character, how he answered questions, the love, how children wanted to come up and be around him. Everything that just was like just coming out of who he was and is. He was like, you know what? Where are we going to go? You have the words of eternal life. Verse 69, also we have come to believe and know that you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Woo! So they believed and they know. Jesus answered them, did I not choose you, the 12? And one of you is a devil. He spoke of Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon, for it was he who would betray him, being one of the 12. Now that's the thing that I wanted you guys to kind of try to imagine in your mind, because this is interesting, because remember, if you were here before, I'm just going to bring it back into play, but Jesus sees everything, right? Like he knows everything. Imagine Jesus's vision at this point, because when he sees, how Satan entered Judas, like he knew that. He could see it. It's an interesting dynamic. What all was going on in Jesus's mind? He was holding the entire world together while he was being crucified on the cross. I mean, the amount of power, it's like, you can do whatever you want to me. It's not going to matter. He's like, that's how powerful he is. It's unbelievable. And we have the audacity. There's people down here on earth that are just like, show me a sign. Prove it to me. There's people, we're reading about them. Prove it to me. I'm just telling you what, it is crazy. Absolutely crazy. So that's John chapter 6, and that was a long one. But hopefully you guys enjoyed it. We can continue on here, but this is pretty neat. This one, if you guys, yeah, okay. Yeah, good. We cannot understand it. No, we can't. And if you guys are here, before I start, I want you guys to know that the only reason I'm here, you guys can disagree with me on some things, and that's fine. But the one thing I want you to know beyond anything else is how to know for sure you can get to heaven. That's the whole point of me being here. And the only way to heaven is by believing that Jesus is God's son, that he led a sinless life and died on the cross for your sins and rose again on the third day. That is how you get to heaven. That is the gospel, which can be found in 1 Corinthians 15, 1 through 4. It's Jesus. It is Christ and Christ alone. And you see that time and time again. It's like people throw baptism in there too. No, Christ was enough. If you throw baptism in there, you're saying Christ was not enough. Jesus was enough. He died on the cross for your sins. He rose again on the third day. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, that whosoever believes. in him shall not perish but have everlasting life. That is it. In Ephesians 2:8-9, for by grace are you saved through faith. You're saved through faith. You're not saved through faith and baptism. For by grace are you saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, it is the gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast. So that is what I want you to know more than anything else. Hopefully you guys understand that, but it is really important to it's really important to know that is what I want you to take away. So we're going to get into John chapter 7, and you missed a lot. Hi, Lydia. I saw somebody tell you to stop yelling, and I saw a couple times where you were yelling and talking in all caps. So try not to do that, please. It's hard. I can't really keep up with everything. But so we're going to get into John chapter 7 here. And it might be a little bit of a long one if you guys are okay with that. I mean, I know I take a long time. Like, I don't know how long that was, but that seems like that was a long time to go through that chapter. But there was 71 verses. That was a lot of ground to cover, and we were all over the place. And here we go. We're going to go into more places. Okay. We're here for it. Let's go. All right, in John chapter 7, verse 1, we'll just go ahead and go right on into it. In John chapter 7, verse 1, it says, after these things, Jesus walked in Galilee, for he did not want to walk in Judea, because the Jews sought to kill him. Now, if you have been paying attention to John's style, you probably already know what I'm going to say about this verse. If not, I'll catch it on YouTube. Yeah, I'll put it up on YouTube. What am I going to say here, guys? Pop quiz. What am I going to say here about John chapter 7, verse 1, if you have been paying attention? After these things, right, Amber? After these things, you're seeing it again. Metatauta, 7, yeah. That's true. That's funny. Not what I was going to say. I was going to say after these things. So metatauta again. Metatauta. My YouTube, Lydia, if you click on my profile picture, there's a little link under my profile picture that will take you to my YouTube. It's just these lives, and I just copy and paste them up there. But in John chapter 7, verse 1, it says, after these things, Jesus walked in Galilee. So metatauta, there it is again. He keeps using it. It's this style of writing. For he did not want to walk in Judea because the Jews sought to kill him. So I wouldn't want to walk there either. It was not yet his time. But here we go into verse 2. It says, now the Jews' Feast of Tabernacles was at hand. Okay, so this is where we're going to get to unpack some of the situation within their feasts. But before we do, let's all go to Romans chapter 15. Romans chapter 15, verse 4. In Romans chapter 15, verse 4, this is a good reminder of everything going on in the Old Testament, right? So in Romans 15, verse 4, it says, for whatever things were written before were written for our learning, that we through the patience and comfort of the scriptures might have hope. All right, so for whatever things were written before, that's important to understand, right? So why? What's going on there? Why was it? It was written for our learning. Okay, so it was written. Oh, sheesh! What's up, B-Rap? So it was written for our learning. Everything in the Old Testament was written for our learning. Okay, so keep that in mind, and let's go to 1 Corinthians 10 now. 1 Corinthians 10, verse 11. Are you following? Sheesh. All right, 1 Corinthians 10, 11. And in 1 Corinthians 10, 11, it says this, now all these things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. Okay, so you have in Romans that it was for our learning. Now you have in 1 Corinthians that all these things happened to them as examples, and that is good to know. So now let's go to Hosea 12, verse 10. And we will get to the point, but I'm just setting the scene here. Hosea 12, verse 10. Hosea 12, verse 10 says this: I have also spoken by the prophets and have multiplied visions. I have given symbols through the witness of the prophets. So your version probably says something differently here, but this is how he speaks. He speaks in similitudes or riddles. We talked about how he talked in riddles or enigmas or dark sayings, as Proverbs 1, Proverbs 1 verse 4. So you're getting an idea here of what's going on here on how he uses, the Bible to speak to us. So you have Romans 15. It talks about why it's used. It's used for our learning. 1 Corinthians, it's used for our as an example. And it's all talking about what's going on back in the Old Testament. So in John 7, verse 2, it says, now the Jews' Feast of Tabernacles was at hand. So that's the idea. So that's what we're trying to zone in here, the Feast of the Tabernacles. But before we get to the Feast of the Tabernacles, let's go to Genesis 1, verse 14. Go to Genesis chapter 1, verse 14. And in Genesis chapter 1, verse 14, it says this: Then God said, let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and seasons, and for days and years. Okay, so you guys have probably read that verse before, but the word seasons there means appointed times. Okay, so appointed times, and if you do a total of the appointed times, there are 70 appointed times here that are referenced within Passover and Shavuot and whatnot. But let's go to Leviticus 23, and let's talk about some of these appointed times. Leviticus chapter 23, because in Leviticus chapter 23, this is where you get trying to hold my place and all these different... Okay, in Leviticus chapter 23, this is the chapter here where you are introduced to the feasts of the Lord. Okay, so there are seven feasts of the Lord. And so we already talked about Romans, like the things, like all these things were given to us for learning, for admonition, for examples. Like all of the things that those verses were talking about are things back in the Old Testament, right? And so we were in the book of John chapter 7, verse 2, and the Feast of Tabernacles is introduced to you, right? Like now we're talking about the Feast of Tabernacles. What's going on? So we went to Genesis 1:14, and we saw the word seasons, and we understand that the word seasons there means appointed times. And so now that we have this appointed times concept, now we're going to Leviticus 23, and we're going to talk about the appointed times. So Leviticus 23, verse 4, it says this: These are the feasts of the Lord, holy convocations, which you shall proclaim at their appointed times. Okay, so their appointed times. And so the feast of the Lord, there are 7 of them, right? So the feast of the Lord. But what is holy convocations? What does that mean? A convocation is basically a holy rehearsal. They basically rehearse an event that was yet to come. So that's basically what the Jewish culture is doing back in the Old Testament, and it's still what they're doing today. It's a holy rehearsal that they rehearsed an event that is yet to come. And so that is the concept. And so that is what a convocation is. It is a holy rehearsal. And so the feast here are the appointed times that it's referring to. These feasts of the Lord are holy rehearsals, which you shall proclaim at their appointed times. Okay, so what's going on with the feast? Let's talk about the feast for a little bit. There are 7 of them. Okay, so if you go to Leviticus 23, verse 4, you are introduced to the Passover. If you go to Leviticus 23, this is all going to be in chapter 23. In verse 6, you are introduced to the unleavened bread. In verse 9, you are introduced to the first fruits. And those three right there are what you would call as spring feasts. Those three are spring feasts, and the last three are the fall feasts. Okay? So those three, you have the Passover, the unleavened bread, and the feasts of first fruits. Those are the spring feasts. And then you get to the next feast, which is called the Feast of Pentecost, or the Feast of Weeks, some people would call them. But then you get to the next one, and it is the Feast of Trumpets, which is a fall feast. You get to the next one, which is the Feast of Atonement, which is the fall feast. The Feast of Atonement is basically the one time out of the year where they would go in. The high priest would go into the temple, the Holy of Holies, and he would only do it under strict ceremonial preparation. But then you get to the last one, which is the Feast of Tabernacles, and that's the last of the fall feast. And so it's interesting. So you unpack all these kind of things, and we're going to dive into it later on when we get further into the book of John. But this is just a brief talking point, because we are talking about the fall feast here, because it's about the Feast of the Tabernacles, right? And so it's really interesting when you try to understand what or how the Jewish people think, right? Like we need to, like you can attack the Bible and like come at it from a Gentile point of view, right? But it's not that's not how we should do it. Like this is like a Jewish Bible. We need to understand why, how the Jewish people think. So in Leviticus 23, verse 33 is where you're introduced to the Feast of Tabernacles. But the Feast of Tabernacles, this was basically the Jews in the Feast of Tabernacles. It's interesting because the Jews they would basically build booths, like booth, like booths. So they would build these booths or tabernacles, and they would live in them for 7 days. And so then after 7 days, they would leave their temporary dwelling place, which was those tabernacles or booths, and they would go back to their permanent home. And that's what they would do. And that's really interesting, because that's why some people think that during the Mount of Transfiguration, they wanted to build up tabernacles. They thought that it might have been on the... Anyways, so get the picture here. The picture of the Feast of Tabernacles is where the Jewish people would build these temporary dwelling places. They would live in them for 7 years, and then they would go away back to their permanent home. So this is why some people think that the Feast of Tabernacles could be a type of the rapture, or it could be a type of the millennial kingdom, because 7 days, 7 years situation. But it's interesting that they would live in a temporary dwelling place for 7 days, and then they would leave to go back to their permanent home, which would be their address, like where I'm at right now. This is my permanent home. So that's just... It's interesting how they mimic these things out, and they don't even really understand what they're doing. But it's just, remember what we read about in Romans and 1 Corinthians. Thanks. Thanks, man. I appreciate that. It's interesting to try to wrap your mind around it. So hold your place here, and let's go back to, let's turn over to Deuteronomy 16:16. We've already talked about Deuteronomy 16:16 multiple times already. But this is important to understand because of how you need to think when it comes to the feasts, because the feasts are very important. These are all types. They're idiomatic of everything going to happen, and they had no idea what they were doing back in the Old Testament or what it was representing, and they're still doing it today without knowing what it's representing, because they're blind in part because they missed the time of their visitation when Jesus rode in on a donkey in Luke. Deuteronomy 16:16, thanks, Lydia. It says, 3 times a year, all your males shall appear before the Lord your God in the place which he chooses. So at the time in John, obviously they chose Jerusalem because that's where the temple was, right? So the choosing was Jerusalem. And then it goes on in verse 16, it says, at the feast of unleavened bread, at the feast of weeks, and at the feast of tabernacles. So you are given 3 different feast here, right? You're given 3 different feasts. Now, when you see Feast of Unleavened Bread, what that is basically talking about, that encapsulates the 3 spring feasts, which is Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and the Feast of First Fruits. So in that context, that's all 3 of them. So you're given in Deuteronomy 16:16, it gives you the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of Weeks, and the Feast of Tabernacles. Now that's interesting. That's interesting. Because those three feasts that are mentioned there in Deuteronomy 16:16, those are the ones that are required, right? Those are the ones that are required for them to go. That's interesting. Those are the ones that are required, and those three feasts parallel major milestones that are happening in the Bible, right? So what's the first one? You have the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Now you understand that the Feast of Unleavened Bread is the Passover unleavened bread and the first fruits, right? That represents the cross. That's the major milestone. What's the next one? The next one represents, or the next one is the Feast of Weeks, Deuteronomy 16:16. Feast of Weeks is the next one. That represents the church. And then what's the last one? The last one is the Feast of Tabernacles, and that represents the second coming. It is just, do you see? It's just, I mean, the whole picture here is just absolutely amazing. It's absolutely amazing. So that's talking a little bit about the feast there, Feast of Tabernacles. So that's what's going on in John. But the Feast of Trumpets is very interesting. But the Feast of Pentecost, or the Feast of Weeks, is also very interesting because the Feast of Pentecost occurred 50 days after the resurrection of Jesus. And it's interesting when you look at the Feast of Weeks or the Feast of Pentecost, because this feast here is the only feast out of all of them that uses leavened bread. And that's interesting because if you know anything about leaven is bad. Like whenever you see leaven in the Bible, it's basically emblematic or idiomatic of sin, right? Like a little leaven leavens a whole lump, right? Like leaven puffs up, right? So like you put leaven in bread and it goes from this to this and now it puffs up, right? Puffs up pride. It's like that kind of situation. But that's what's going on here in the Feast of Weeks, because the Feast of Weeks, this is the only feast where they use leavened bread. And that's very interesting because, well, it's also interesting with this is because Enoch is, people look at this and look at it as Enoch could possibly be a type of the church. Because if you look at, if you think about it, if you think about the flood, for example, you think about the flood and you look at the flood, there are basically three categories of people, right? You have three different categories of people. You have people, you have the people who were saved during the flood, everybody who was in the ark. You have people who perished during the flood. But then you have an interesting guy who has the oldest prophecy in the Bible, which is given in the book of Jude. You have a guy named Enoch. And Enoch shows up, and he was removed before the flood. And so that's why people look at Enoch as a type of the church, because that fits the pre-tribulation model, because Enoch was removed before the flood. If you study the flood, if you look at the flood, everybody who went into the ark was saved. It was sealed. God sealed it. Everybody in there, boom, you're good. Everybody outside perished. The rains didn't come until the door was sealed. Anyways, it's just interesting connections to really dive in there. But these in Leviticus 23 verse 4, it says, "These feasts of the Lord, a holy convocation." These are rehearsals for things that are going to happen later on in the future. From the Levitical standpoint, these things were all happening in the future, and if you dive into it, which we will eventually, it's really, really cool what they do. But the Feast of Tabernacles is the one that we want to talk about, and that's basically where they would go out, they would build a temporary living place, and they would live there 7 days, and then they would go home to their permanent dwelling place, and the picture there is really neat. But it's also really neat in Deuteronomy 16:16, the three that are mentioned all are massive parallels to everything going on in the Bible. The Feast of Unleavened Bread in Deuteronomy 16:16. That's the cross. The Feast of Weeks, that's the church. The Feast of Tabernacle, that is the second coming. It's really, really neat. So anyways, keep all that in mind. Let's go back to John chapter 7. Because in John chapter 7, verse 2, now we can understand a little bit more, hopefully. John chapter 7, verse 2, it says, Now the Jews' Feast of Tabernacles was at hand. This was one of those where it was required for everybody to go down, remember, for the temple. In verse 3, it says, His brothers therefore said to him, Depart from here and go into Judea, that your disciples also may see the works that you are doing. Now we're going to start hearing about these brothers of Jesus who do not believe in Jesus. And it's really mind-blowing that his own brothers, half-brothers, didn't really believe in him. And that's very, very interesting. So in verse 4 it says, For no one does anything in secret while he himself seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world. For even his brothers did not believe him. And that is very crazy to consider, right? So here you have it. It says in verse 5, it says, For even his brothers did not believe him. Now it's important to understand that James and Jude will end up as believers, but currently right now seems that they do not, from what we are given. But James and Jude do end up believing Jesus. In verse 6, though, John chapter 7, verse 6, it says, Then Jesus said to them, My time has not yet come, but your time is always ready. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me, because I testify of it that its works are evil. And this is just interesting because it is mind-blowing to me how our world is, just using this as a personal application in our world. If you go up to somebody and you call them out on anything, and I don't care if you use the most loving approach or whatever, they're not going to like it. Isn't that interesting? We just want to run for the darkness, when somebody calls us out on our crap, right? And he says in verse 7, The world cannot hate you, but it hates me because I testify of it that its works are evil. They will hate you. Obviously, they hate me. That comes later. But anyways, in verse 8, it says, You go up to this Feast of Tabernacles. I am not yet going up to this feast, for my time has not yet fully come. And this is interesting because it's always on his schedule, right? And that's why I think it's really neat to understand the Daniel 9 prophecy, because in the Daniel 9 prophecy, Daniel 9, it talks about how he's going to arrive into Jerusalem, present himself as the king, Messiah, and it was foretold 483 years ago. That clock is getting dangerously close to expiring to where he's going to need to show up as king. But it hasn't happened yet. Everything is on his schedule, right? And it's important to understand that. It's all about perspective. How do you live your life? Are you doing everything for you, or are you doing things for him? Are you living your life for him? It's funny because he says, For my time has not yet fully come. And it's his time. His time. But in verse 9 it says, When he had said these things to them, he remained in Galilee. But when his brothers had gone up, then he also went up to the feast, not openly, but as it were in secret. Then the Jews sought him at the feast and said, Where is he? And there was much complaining among the people concerning him. Some said, He is good. Others said, No, on the contrary, he deceives the people. Those would be the politically correct people, right? Or no, we're getting to the politically correct people. However, no one spoke openly of him for fear of the Jews. So you can understand the power of the fear of these guys had over these guys. It's interesting. And it kind of, whenever you read a story, you always wonder oh, I wouldn't do that. Or, hey, I can't believe that these people would do that. Or how could he? Or I would never. That's on kind of how we think. But I would disagree. And it's interesting because, during the Holocaust, there were Jewish people being slaughtered. And the question that I find myself asking is, where was America? Where were we when all of this stuff is happening? And it's crazy to kind of ask these questions because we're the good guys, right? Very interesting world we are living in, but you would like to think that you would do something, but would you? Do you think you would? Guess we'll find out. But it is interesting in verse 13, it said, however, no one spoke openly of him for fear of the Jews, meaning they wanted to talk about him. They wanted to talk about him, but they didn't. No, it's not coffee. It's not mentioned. It's very dubious. In verse 14, it says, now about the middle of the feast, Jesus went up into the temple and taught. Now, this is the temple. Remember, you have the two temples. You have King Solomon's temple. That got destroyed by King Nebuchadnezzar. That's gone. Now another temple comes up, built by Zerubbabel, and then Zerubbabel or King Herod goes in and basically makes it grander. Thank you for giving, appreciate that. So now we're in Zerubbabel or King Herod's temple, and that's the temple that Jesus is in right now. And so in verse 14 it says, now about the middle of the feast, Jesus went up into the temple and taught. And the Jews marveled, saying, how does this man know letters, having never studied? They're like, wait a second, you didn't go through all of our rituals and catechism or whatever. How does this man know letters, having never studied? Jesus answered them and said, my doctrine is not mine, but his who sent me. If anyone wills to do his will, he shall know concerning the doctrine, whether it is from God or whether I speak on my own authority. We talked about that before, about like how to know if somebody is a good teacher, because the majority of people, guys, it's important to understand you need to know for yourself what you believe and why you believe it. You know, listen to what I'm saying, hear what I'm saying, but test it. Don't believe it just because I say. I'm just a dude out on TikTok, right? Like, you need to know it for yourself, because when you stand before the Lord, it's just going to be you and him. It's just going to be you're not going to have your parents next to you. You're not going to have your wife or husband or boyfriend or girlfriend or kids next to you. It is going to be one-on-one, and that is interesting. So you got to know what you need to know it for yourself. And just be on guard, because the majority of people out there are false teachers, in my opinion. But anyways, verse 18, it says, he who speaks for himself seeks his own glory. But he who seeks the glory of the one who sent him is true, and no unrighteousness is in him. Did not Moses give you the law, yet none of you keeps the law? Why do you seek to kill me? Now he's bringing Moses back into play, and he's talking to people who are basically professional law keepers. These guys, remember, the Jewish people want to be under the law. They study the law. This is who they are. So they are professional law keepers in a sense. And so he's saying in verse 19, did not Moses give you the law, yet none of you keeps the law? Why do you seek to kill me? He's calling them out. But what is he talking about? Let's unpack it a little bit more. Let's keep going. In verse 20, it says, the people answered and said, you have a demon. Who is seeking to kill you? Jesus answered and said to them, I did one work, and you all marvel. Moses, therefore, gave you circumcision, not that it is from Moses, but from the fathers. And you circumcise a man on the Sabbath. Okay, so let's talk about this for a second. So Jesus brings Moses into play. Moses, therefore, gave you circumcision. Okay, so first off, it's important to understand that circumcision goes back to Abraham, and it is older than the Mosaic law. And you can go back into Genesis 17 and figure that out and read about it yourself. But circumcision is older than Moses. It's also important to understand that Abraham was saved before he was circumcised. So circumcision, what's going on with circumcision? Why is Jesus bringing it into play? In verse 22, Moses therefore gave you circumcision, not that it is from Moses, but from the fathers. And then he goes on to say this, and you circumcise a man on the Sabbath. That is illegal. So Jesus is calling them out for breaking the law, because that is a work, right? You're not allowed. For these people back then, that was wrong to do that kind of stuff. Where it says, and you circumcise a man on the Sabbath. That was against the law. Circumcision required breaking the Sabbath laws. And yet they did it. And the reason why they broke the law is because they had the law, and this is interesting. They had the law. First off, the law is basically a mirror to show us that we are lost sinners. That's why the law is here. The law is given so that we can know, like it's a mirror to let us know that we are lost sinners. It's basically, the law is basically a teacher in a sense, if you want to look at it that kind of way. And the law lets us know that we are lost. So we are being taught by the law. Hey, this is the law. Hey, if this is the law, wait a second, I can't do this. Like, this is teaching me that this is impossible. Are you kidding me? If this is the law, I am done, right? So it's teaching us that we cannot obtain righteousness by going after the law, right? So the law, we can't do it. So the law is a mirror of sorts. But it's interesting because what they were told to do, as far as circumcision is concerned, is that back in the Old Testament, they were told to circumcise a newborn on the 8th day. And I don't know if you guys have heard this before, but it's really quite fascinating. But they were told to circumcise the children on the 8th day, and the reason that they were told to circumcise children on the 8th day is because buildup within the children's bodies, there was something, I can't remember what it is, but there's vitamin K and something like prothorban or something like that. And it would build up, and it was a clotting kind of agent. And it was the highest of those kind of prothorban and vitamin K. All of that was at its peak level on the 8th day. And so that is when they were told to perform the circumcision. And so it's interesting because if you think about it, so a baby is born, 8 days later, they were to perform the circumcision. Okay? So my question is, what I'm trying to get you to see here is that if you go all the way to, like, what if they were born on this day? What if they were born on this day? Well, if they have to go off of every 8 days, like wait until the baby is 8 days old and then do it, that's considered a work. So they were circumcising babies on the 8th day, and sometimes the eighth day was on a Sabbath. So do you see what I'm saying? So they were told what to do. They were doing what they were told to do, but then in a sense, it was kind of a breaking the law, but they didn't even really view that as breaking the law. And so Jesus is calling them out and saying, you break the law. What are you talking about? You're not even listening to yourself. Moses therefore gave you circumcision, not that it is from Moses, but from the fathers, and you circumcise a man on the Sabbath. If a man receives circumcision on the Sabbath, so that the law of Moses should not be broken, are you angry with me because I made a man completely well on the Sabbath? Do not judge according to appearance, but judge with righteous judgment. They were not judging with righteous judgment. They were picking and choosing on how to basically what they were going to, like, hey, we're going to make a big deal about this, but we're not going to make a big deal about that. Kind of like what the world does every single day. I'm sure you guys can completely relate with that, but hopefully you guys are understanding what the concept is here. He's calling them out and he's like, you guys aren't doing it. And it's just an interesting thing. But in verse 25, it says, now some of them from Jerusalem said, is this not he whom they seek to kill? But look, he speaks boldly, and they say nothing to him. Do the rulers know indeed that this is truly the Christ? However, we know where this man is from, but when the Christ comes, no one knows where he is from. Then Jesus cried out as he taught in the temple, saying, you both know me, and you know where I am from, and I have not come of myself, but he who sent me is true, whom you do not know. But I know him, for I am from him, and he sent me. Therefore they sought to take him, but no one laid a hand on him, because his hour had not yet come. You guys are seeing how we're getting closer and closer to that Daniel 9 prophecy coming into play. And that's kind of fun if you understand the Daniel 9 prophecy, if you keep that in the back of your mind, you see how every single second is getting us closer to that prophecy being fulfilled. To nobody's knowledge, nobody, even his disciples, had any idea what Jesus was doing when he did that. Everything he was doing, he was fulfilling prophecies left and right, left and right, left and right in front of their eyes, and they had no clue. That is amazing. So the Daniel 9 one is just one that I like to to pick out because it's one of the most major, amazing prophecies in the entire Bible. But it goes back to saying his hour had not come. And that's what I can't help but think of, because his hour is coming, but it makes me think of the Daniel 9 prophecy. Time is winding down here to that being fulfilled. And it kind of helps you see things in a perspective kind of way when you keep that in mind. But in verse 31, it says, "And many of the people believed in him and said, 'When the Christ comes, will he do more signs than these, which this man has done?' The Pharisees heard the crowd murmuring these things concerning him, and the Pharisees and the chief priests sent officers to take him. Then Jesus said to them, 'I shall be with you a little while longer, and then I go to him who sent me. You will seek me and not find me, and where I am you cannot come.' Then the Jews said among themselves, 'Where does he intend to go that we shall not find him? Does he intend to go to the dispersion among the Greeks and teach the Greeks? What is this thing that he said, you will seek me and not find me, and where I am you cannot come?'" It's so interesting and yet so relatable in a sense, because how many times have you guys might have read what we're going over. You might have read it yourself, right? But it's almost like until it's said a certain way that it doesn't really click. Or you haven't seen something from a certain perspective, or you're like, "Oh, I didn't know that," or "Oh, that makes so much more sense because this over," like these guys are not getting it. They're hearing, but they're not getting it. There's a difference between hearing and understanding. And so that is what is so interesting. These guys are literally hearing it from God Almighty's mouth, and they are not understanding. It's quite something. But in verse 37, it says, "On the last day, that great day of the feast, Jesus stood and cried out, saying, 'If anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink.'" Now, it's interesting because it says very specifically in verse 37, it says, "On the last day, that great day of the feast," the last day, the great day of the feast, right? So the last day, because on the last day, what they do is they pour water out. They do a whole bunch of pouring waters out, like there's double portion, because if you go back and you chase that thread of water and you go to the rock, Jesus was the rock, as it talks about in 1 Corinthians. The rock, Moses was supposed to strike the rock. The rock that's being struck is Christ being struck, slain. And then the second time, Moses was supposed to speak to the rock, but Moses was mad, so he struck the rock again. That ruined the picture, right? The picture was supposed to be Jesus being struck, and then somebody speaking to the rock. Like there was a certain picture there, but Moses ruined the picture. He struck it the first time, and he struck it the second time. The water came out both times, but Moses ruined the picture, which is why Moses wasn't allowed to go into the promised land. And so it's an interesting thing. But on the last day, though, they're pouring water out into the streets. And so it's interesting to understand that, because when you understand that that's what's going on during this feast, you get to see this a little bit differently. So now that you understand that they're pouring water out into the streets, now let's read it again. Verse 37, "On the last day, that great day of the feast, Jesus stood and cried out, saying, 'If anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink.'" Now it takes place. Now it hits a little bit differently, right? Because they're pouring water out. Like that's what they did. They would pour water out, like a double portion of it. And it's interesting that they're pouring water out, and Jesus is saying, "If anyone thirsts, let him come to me." Verse 38, "He who believes in me, as the scripture has said, out of his heart will flow rivers of living water. But this he spoke concerning the Spirit, whom those believing in him would receive. For the Holy Spirit was not yet given because Jesus was not yet glorified." It's interesting. Remember what we talked about before. You and I are living in a world where we have the Holy Spirit. Back then, they did not. It's different now. Everything changes. Jesus changed everything. He changed it all. When Jesus died, he ascended up. He's like, "It's better that I go so that the Holy Spirit may abound." You and I have the Holy Spirit. We don't have to go to a priest anymore. We don't have to go confess our sins to a person, like a priest who is representing like the high priest. We don't have to do that. When Jesus died, now we have the Holy Spirit. Now We can just talk straight to God, and it's something that they didn't have the ability to do back then. They they had to go through all kinds of ceremonies and procedures to do that kind of thing. And that's why I say, like, the people in the Old Testament would rather be in our day because of the things that you and I are able to do and the things that we can see. And they didn't have perspective. They were walking blindly. It's crazy to see this kind of stuff. But it says in verse 39, in the middle of verse 39, it says, for the Holy Spirit was not yet given. Why was it not yet given? Because Jesus was not yet glorified. Remember when Jesus died on the cross and he came back and he didn't allow anybody to touch him? When he didn't allow anybody to touch him, he's like, I have not yet been glorified. Interesting. And then after he comes back the second time, he's like, go ahead and touch my hands. He's like, go ahead, do it, touch me here, do what you need to do. There was something that changed. There's a whole bunch of things that happened, and apparently that's when he was glorified. And it is crazy to think about it. But the Holy Spirit was not yet given because Jesus was not yet glorified. It's an interesting dynamic and something that you can try to unpack and try to wrap your mind around. There's all kinds of fun things that you can chase down that little trail there. But we'll just move on. But in verse 40 it says, therefore many from the crowd, when they heard this saying, said, truly this is the prophet. Others said, this is the Christ. But some said, will the Christ come out of Galilee? Has not the scripture said that Christ comes from the seed of David and from the town of Bethlehem where David was? That guy, whoever said that in verse 42, was paying attention. That's interesting. You're seeing some stuff, but let's go to Isaiah 9 real fast. Isaiah chapter 9. Okay, in Isaiah 9, verse 6, this is a verse that you guys are going to start seeing probably pop up in your mailbox here pretty soon from people who are going to send you Christmas pictures. But it says, Isaiah 9, verse 6, it says this, for unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government will be upon his shoulder, and his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Now, this is a verse you guys are all probably very, very familiar with. But what is interesting is the very first two lines, at least in my Bible. The first line says, for unto us a child is born. The second line says, unto us a son is given. And what you need to understand here is that these are two very, very different things that are being talked about here. The first one, for unto us a child is born. That is not the same thing. Jesus was born in Bethlehem. Unto us a son is given. He was given at Golgotha when he died. There's a difference there. And so, yeah, I know people stamp it on their Christmas cards, and it's a great verse, but the understanding is important, right? For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given. Understand that those are two very separate events. He's born and then he's given. And that is powerful because it just makes you realize the beauty and the amazing architecture within the Bible. And it's something that could only be done by somebody who is outside of time, an author that is outside of time. I mean, you can see. So anyways, in John chapter 7, verse 42, this guy nails it on the head because he must have been reading. He must have been studying because he says, has not the scripture said that the Christ comes from the seed of David and from the town of Bethlehem where David was? Good for you, man. In verse 43, so there was a division among the people because of him. And I want to talk about this because this is important. This is important. It says, so there was a division among the people because of him. And right now, guys, I mean, you guys are paying attention, I'm sure, to what's going on in Israel. You're seeing all kinds of lines, different lines, divisions, divide and conquer type mentality that's going on in the entire world on a global stage. And it's absolutely It's amazing. But in this verse 43, it says, division among the people because of him. And that is the world in a nutshell, in a sense. Division among the people because of him. And so you are either for him or you're against him. We could end it right there. You're either for him or you're against him. And it's such a small verse, but it encapsulates the entire picture of what's going on in the world. A division among the people because of him. You know, he didn't come to bring peace, but a sword. And it's just an interesting concept. I mean, that's really what it boils down to right there. If we were all for him, our world would look a whole lot different. But we are not. We are not all for him. There are people who are against him. The majority are. Like I said, that one verse, broad is the way. Broad is the way that leads to destruction, and narrow is the gate that leads to life, and few there are that find it. So it's a lot against the little. But in verse 44 it says, now some of them wanted to take him, but no one laid hands on him. Then the officers came to the chief priests and Pharisees, who said to them, why have you not brought him? Verse 46, the officers answered, no man ever spoke like this. Very relatable, guys. Can you imagine going up and hearing this guy's words and just hearing all the rumors and the stories of this guy named Jesus? And then you're told to go arrest him, and then you show back up and you're like, why have you not brought him? And they're like, no one has ever spoke like him. They got it. Verse 47, then the Pharisees answered them, are you also deceived? You can just feel them getting all heated. Verse 48, have any of the rulers or Pharisees believed in him? But this crowd that does not know the law is accursed. And now now Nicodemus pops his head back in, because we haven't heard from him, I think, since chapter 3. And he says, in verse 50, it says, Nicodemus, he who came to Jesus by night, being one of them, said to them, does our law judge a man before it hears him and knows what he is doing? Interesting. Nicodemus shows up and starts to defend Jesus. So these guys are all getting worked up about Jesus, and Nicodemus, with his popularity and all the weight that he carries, he says, does our law judge a man before it hears him and knows what he is doing? Verse 52, it says, they answered and said to him, are you also from Galilee? Search and look, for no prophet has arisen out of Galilee. And everyone went to his own house. And so here is a very good thing, a great lesson, honestly, to learn to end this chapter. Because in verse 52, it says this, they answered and said to him, are you also from Galilee? Search and look, for no prophet has arisen out of Galilee. And so this is important, because first off, understand who's talking here. These are the head honchos. These are the religious leaders. These are the pastors, the preachers, the reverends, the priests. These are those that are speaking right now. So keep that in mind. Imagine a pastor, imagine a priest, imagine the Pope, whatever you want to imagine. Imagine a guy who is in a religious kind of authority or position. Because now let's go read it again. Keep that guy in mind. It says, are you also from Galilee? Search and look, for no prophet has arisen out of Galilee. I need you to understand this. These religious leaders were wrong. They were wrong. They came back at Nicodemus and said, search and look, for no prophet has arisen out of Galilee. They were wrong when they said that. And it's important to understand that, because that's a huge lesson, because the importance of that is to understand that there are people out there who say things that have a title. There are people out there who have stature, popularity, reputation, who have 1 million followers, who have TikToks and YouTube videos and Zangas and MySpaces, Facebooks, people they're influencers, right? And they'll throw a verse out there, and they'll throw another verse out there, and hey, this verse was right, this verse was right, and they'll lure you in, and they'll make you feel all nice and warm and cuddly, and then they will lie to you subtly. It'll be a subtle lie, like this one right here. You didn't know that this was incorrect. You probably would just read it and be like, oh, okay, I guess there was no prophet that has arisen out of Galilee. But they're wrong. And my point is to understand that these people, there are people out there who are wrong. So just so you know, Jonah and Nahum were prophets out of Galilee. Those guys are in the Old Testament. These religious leaders had the Old Testament. They had it. They were the ones studying it. They were the ones teaching it. And they lashed out back at Nicodemus and said, are you also from Galilee? Search and look, for no prophet has arisen out of Galilee. But they were wrong. And it's important to understand there's false teachers out there. They're lying to you. They may not even realize that they're lying to you. And that is even more worrisome because then they're going to come across as very sincere. And I want you to understand that I don't care how you feel. I don't care how your emotions are. I don't care. I don't care about mine. Don't care about mine. Don't care how I feel. What does the Bible say? Go to it. Dive in. Like, this is what matters. Because how dangerous are your emotions? Can you imagine if we lived off of your emotions? When somebody cuts you off in traffic, if you're just like, mother, you just like want to just start going off your emotions. You're up here and then you're back down once you calm down. Emotions are dangerous, guys. Go off of the word of God. These guys, these religious leaders got all emotional and said something that was incorrect, and they were wrong. And so there's a big lesson there. So I'll leave that for you guys to have. But there you go. Hi, Jess. All right, guys, that's what I got for you today. I mean, we've been going for a couple hours now. I don't know how long it's been. About 3.5 hours or so. But there's a lot in there for those 2 chapters. But it was a good one. So hopefully you guys enjoyed it. Lydia, why do you spell you? Why you? Ryan, I sent you. Night, Deidre. Thanks, Holly. Oscar. Ryan, thank you, my broski in Christ. Yeah, Oscar. Absolutely, man. Thanks for being here. Thank you for that, Holly. Thanks, Nathaniel. I appreciate it. Are you a hillbilly? Thank you. Yeah, Beth, absolutely. For sure. Little Lolo. Yeah, guys, if you guys have any free time, yeah, Vicky, thank you. Absolutely. I'm happy to do it. I'm going to go to bed soon because I got church in the morning. So hopefully you guys are going to church in the morning. I got to wake up in 5 hours. Great. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Thanks, guys. There's a lot in here, and it's difficult to really wrap your minds around, but hopefully you guys are starting to see things differently. Hopefully you guys are starting to see a word and now be like, oh, I get what that means, or that means this, or like that connects back to here. Because once that starts happening, then man, that is just one of the coolest things. Do you go live at a specific time and day for Bible study, or is it just random? Hi, Natalie. It is basically nighttime. I'm a night guy, so it's about 2 times a week now where I'll go live, and it's normally about 11:30. I'm kind of shadow banned right now, so if I post a video, it's not being put out to the algorithm, and I know that because I just posted my story a couple hours before I went live tonight, and there was only like 20 or 30 people who actually saw it, and so that's very uncommon because normally a story gets a lot. And so I don't know, you're just gonna have to pay attention. But what I typically do is I put out a story and let people know a couple hours in advance, just in case they're interested, if they would like to. But just so you know, if you're interested, you can click on my profile picture And I put all of these videos up on YouTube if you want to go back and rewatch them. We went through the book of Revelation. That's a great study. That's on YouTube. Daniel's on YouTube. Ruth is on YouTube. And now we're going through John. And these videos will be up on YouTube soon. And also, if you guys have any questions, feel free to shoot me a direct message on here. Just click on my profile picture and just hit message. And I would love to talk to you about anything you got going on. But yeah, thank you, Ryan. God bless you. And yeah, aloha. Are you in are you in Hawaii? What time zone? I am Eastern Standard Time. I'm a night owl as well. Nice. Gotta stick together. Psalm 109.109.8 for Biden. Oh gosh. I'm afraid to look that one up. But I will, because now I'm interested. What's it gonna be? That's hilarious. Psalms 109 verse 8 for Biden is what Holly said in the verse. The verse says, let his days be few and let another take his office. That's funny. That's funny. Oh. I gotta highlight that one. Holly, I'm probably gonna bring that up at church tomorrow. I'll be like, guys, I got a word. That is too funny. Oh, beautiful. Yes. But yeah, guys, if you guys you know what? That's what everybody's gonna remember now. What you learned tonight at Bible study? Biden. That is good. That's hilarious. That is too funny. I accidentally swiped out of here. Well, welcome back. I knew you were going to highlight that. I just got it from Chosen One. Oh, nice. That's from Chosen. Good one. That is perfect. But yeah, guys, I'm gonna get out of here. I think the very latest I'll go live again is probably Thursday night. I might try to go earlier than that. We'll see. Life's kind of crazy right now, and sleep and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, Alyssa, I'm glad you're here. But if you guys have any questions, feel free to shoot me a message, and I think I'll probably try to go live again at the very least Thursday night. Probably around 11:30 is when I typically go. 11:30, 12 o'clock ish, midnight. If you guys are interested, that is the worst case scenario. I would imagine would be on Thursday. And before I go, I want you guys to know that the most important thing is to know how to know for sure you can get to heaven. And that is by believing that Jesus is God's son, that he led a sinless life, that he died on the cross for your sins, that he rose again on the third day, and that for the Bible says, for whosoever calls upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. It is belief in what Jesus did and who he is. That is it. That's it. For by grace are you saved through faith. So you're saved through faith. That's it. It's not of works. It's a gift of God. I mean, the whole picture is so cool. But that's it. That's what I want you guys to know more than anything else. Christ and Christ alone, guys. That's first base. Second base, baptism. Baptism doesn't save you. Third base, good works. Good works don't save you. Home plate, sharing Jesus with others. That is the little thing I go to. But yeah, that's what I want you to take away more than anything else. If you guys have any questions, feel free to shoot me a message. I would love to talk to you. And yeah, Thanks for being here. I was kind of a little bummed because being shadow band sucks, but it's nice because it shows like there's over 200 people in here, which is really cool, and I love that. So it's kind of, unless everybody in here is following me, which I highly doubt, which is completely fine. I don't care about followers, but it's nice that there are people who are interested, and the shadow banning thing really sucks. Chosen knows all about that. I was asking them about it, yeah, hugs, Katie. Thank you guys for being here. And worst case scenario will be Thursday night, probably around 11:30 p.m. And I will try to post a story and let you guys know a couple hours in advance. And shadow ban, yeah, rest up, Ryan. Shadow ban is just when they kind of allow your account to be active, but they don't put your stuff out in the algorithm so people can find you very easily. So not Tuesday, Thursday, Katie, Thursday. But hopefully you guys enjoy Sunday. Hopefully you guys go to church tomorrow. It's very important. It encourages the pastor when you go. It encourages others when you show up with questions and you ask questions and you have that kind of edifying kind of conversation that is very important to have. Everybody learns when you ask questions, and it's important to do that. Somebody might have never thought to ask a certain question. So if you ask it, then they'll be like, oh, okay, well, that makes sense. And they're learning, and that's what we need to be doing. Alyssa, you're getting baptized tomorrow? What? I just muted her. How do I unmute her? Shoot. How do you unmute somebody? I meant to pin something. Can you unmute her? Somebody? Alyssa, I'm sorry. Oh, thank you. Jalen, thank you. I meant to pin your comment there, Alyssa. I'm all thumbs. But that's cool. Somebody else is getting baptized in here. Who was it? Blackbird with her kids are getting baptized tomorrow. So that is really neat, guys. And Alyssa, I would love, so I'm interested. I'm very, what's the word? I'm very invested in your walk right now, because you came up here, we had a voice conversation on a couple of these lives, and you said that you were kind of being torn between Islam and Christianity, and you're diving into it, and you're trying to learn, and now it seems like I'm assuming, have you trusted Christ as your personal savior then? Because if you have, that is wonderful, and are you here still? That is awesome if you have. I'm assuming that's why you're getting baptized. But, I just like making sure. Lydia, happy birthday. Yes. Oh, man. Okay, I don't know if she's still here. But thank you guys for being here. And hopefully see you on Thursday, if not sooner. You guys be safe.